A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are live in Singapore with DNV, the independent expert in assurance and risk management. A warm welcome to DNV's Singapore Energy Transition Conference, or SETC for short. My name is Yvonne Chan. It's my pleasure to be your host and moderator for today. Now, on behalf of DNV, we would like to extend also a warm welcome to the Energy Market Authority of Singapore and the, not the monetary, but the Maritime Port Authority of Singapore. We want to thank you for your contributions to our conference on the energy transition in Southeast Asia. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our virtual guests dialing in from many parts of the world. It's good to have you join us. Now, as the world's most dynamic economic region, Southeast Asia's energy transition plays a critical role in the global race towards net zero. And so this conference brings together industry experts and thought leaders to discuss the opportunities and challenges in the regional energy sector and the role that Singapore can play as the Center for Finance and Innovation. Now, before we begin, please allow me to just share with you some really quick housekeeping tips to ensure that your participation in our conference today will be as seamless as possible. So to my guests here in the ballroom at the Conrad Centennial in Singapore, please kindly turn your mobile devices to silent mode, but do keep them handy too, because we will need you to use your mobile devices to scan a QR code. We will flash that up later on, and this will bring you to our engagement platform. And there you can leave your comments and questions for our speakers during the panel discussion. We will also invite you to take part in some poll questions, so do look out for that. At this juncture, on behalf of DNV, we also want to express our appreciation to our supporting partners for the SETC. So a big thank you to Norwegian Energy Partners, the Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore, and the Singapore International Energy Week, or SIU. SIU is going to be taking place at the end of October, and I believe many of you will be attending that too. And if you're worried about missing any parts of the content pieces today, not to worry, because the event is being recorded and a copy of the conference or the video of that will be made available to you in the next few days. And now with that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to officially start the DNV SETC because we have an exciting agenda lined up for you. As the global energy transition picks up pace, it's affecting a lot of industries, and everyone has to play their part. Not taking a proactive approach to the energy transition could leave your organization's potential growth at risk. So here today to share a timely update on the energy transition at large is Remy Eriksson. He's the group president and the CEO of DNV. And with 3 decades at DNV, Remy brings with him wide management and technical experience working in oil and gas, maritime, and the renewable energy industries. And he's worked in various parts around the world, including Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Americas. So he's unable to join us in person, but he has shared some interesting perspectives all the way from Norway. Let's take a listen. Well, it's great to have you with us, Remy. You have been addressing the energy transition since 2017 with DNV's ETO. And now, 6 years later, in another year of record temperatures, how optimistic are you personally that we can still meet the Paris Agreement targets of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius?
Well, 2 years ago, ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, when DNV issued our first pathway to net zero, we said, the window to net zero by 2050 is narrowing. Well, 24 months have gone by without any major economy really accelerating decarbonization to the level needed. This year we will have record global emissions once more, so the window for meeting the Paris Agreement goals is almost closed, but I believe we could still squeeze through with some difficulty. We will be publishing an update to our pathway later this year, and we will show how there is still a way forward to reach net zero by 2050 without harming global growth. But it will call for very large upfront investments which is politically challenging when the world is at risk of global economic recession. And I should add, however, that the risk of not reaching net zero at or near 2050 is also enormously costly. And we are really starting to see the costs of climate damage escalate from deadly heat waves to wildfires to floods in South Korea and Western Canada, for example. So tough choices lie ahead, and there is every reason to see what we can do to accelerate the transition.
Well, we definitely need more decisive action on that front. But let's talk about Southeast Asia. As the fastest growing economy in the world, this region plays a key role in the global energy transition. However, the expansion of renewable energies is progressing pretty slowly, while coal and oil continue to dominate the energy mix. What do you think are some of the biggest hurdles to this regional energy transition, and how can they be overcome? Remy.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. Southeast Asia is a region where many of the dilemmas of the energy transition are playing out dramatically. On the one hand, there is great technical potential for solar and wind power in many parts of the region. On the other hand, the region is rich in natural gas and coal. It is the world's largest exporter of coal, and it is very difficult to wean itself off those resources. In Indonesia, for example, phasing out coal is politically very unpopular, and recently, the supply choke of natural gas caused by the Ukraine war has also given the region's coal industry a boost. The other major factor at play is that Southeast Asia's economy is growing rapidly on a per capita basis. GDP will triple by 2050. So I think we must accept that in the next few years, growing prosperity will be underpinned by fossil energy sources. But there is a value in constructing a longer-term forecast because we do see a major shift ahead. There is 80% reliance on fossil energy today, and that drops to 50% by 2050. The challenge is that wind and solar account for only 28% of the primary energy mix in 2050. And we believe there is much greater potential than that. A big part of unlocking that potential is about policy choices and creating an environment for investment in renewables, grid modernization, and storage capacity. For example, the institution and introduction of reasonable feed-in tariffs in Vietnam has recently given renewables a big boost there. And let's not be mistaken, there is good news ahead in the region's transition. For example, the electricity mix will transition from 90% fossil today to almost 90% non-fossil by 2050. And that is critically important for a region where energy demand for the cooling of buildings is going to skyrocket almost 30-fold according to our forecast. But the central challenge to the transition will be electrifying road transport and transitioning to electric mass transit. Regional governments are going to have a relook at how to make the uptake of EVs more attractive through incentives and by helping to invest in the electrical infrastructure needed.
Well, speaking of governments, policy, and incentives, we know that in the short term, the expansion of clean energy could be at odds with energy security and affordability. So what should politicians do to keep their people's support and get their buy-in?
This needs a very careful thought. A forced shift away from coal-fired power could result in higher energy costs in the short term. And that is in fact reflected in our forecast too, where renewables only really take off from around 2030. And so, in fact, we do not see dramatic short-term trade-offs, but by 2030, the energy world will be looking quite a lot different than it is today. For one thing, the cost of renewables will have kept falling, and by then, every other generation source will look expensive by comparison. Even coal in your backyard. Secondly, Southeast Asia remains very exposed to the oil price shocks, and inflexible coal-fired power is not a safe bet long-term for at least two reasons. Firstly, carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the Scope 3 commitments of the buyers of Southeast Asia's manufactured exports will place additional pressure on coal-reliant production. Secondly, preferential and cheaper international capital will be made increasingly available for the vital task of modernizing and extending electricity grids to provide the clean power that the fast-growing region will need. I should note that from a technical standpoint, studies by the Asian Development Bank indicate that even relatively underdeveloped power systems, such as Cambodia's, can integrate up to 10% variable renewable energy without difficulty, which accords with our research at DNV. Integrating much larger amounts of variable renewables is of course a challenge, but it's by no means insurmountable, and Southeast Asia will have the benefit of following where other rapidly transitioning regions like China and Europe will have gone. But Yvonne, there is no escaping the fact that careful and brave political stewardship is needed to make the transition rewarding, or at least tolerable in the shorter term. And public information campaigns about the long-term energy security, health and economics benefits of clean energy are also needed.
That's a great point you make there, Remy. Well, many industries and transport sectors will compete for the same energy sources of the future. So can we just leave this emerging demand-supply challenge to the market? Will that be efficient?
I would say the picture is mixed. At the moment, road transport effectively competes for oil. EVs is not competing in a similar traditional fashion, but the hard-to-abate sectors like long-distance transport on road, aviation, shipping, and heavy industry will be in competition as they diversify their fuel mixes. There, it would be unwise to simply leave matters entirely to the market. Countries need to invest proactively in green corridors and other infrastructure that will make their participation in these global industries competitive and attractive. We see this clearly emerging in policies in the EU, for instance Fit for 55, and in the US IRA, where strong incentives are applied for switching, for example, to sustainable bioenergy and to hydrogen-based fuels.
Well, we all agree that collaboration is the key to accelerate the energy transition. So tell us a bit about DNV's work, for example, with the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization right here in Singapore, or the recently announced UAE Maritime Decarbonization Center.
Well, rebuilding entire energy supply chains is an enormous undertaking, and it is not something that individual companies can lift alone. DNV already plays a very significant coordinating and standard-setting role in both the global maritime and energy industries. And so for us, it is a natural step. In fact, I would go further and say it is our duty to fund and participate in institutions like the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization in Singapore and the UAE Maritime Decarbonization Center, where there are like-minded participants and governments committed to having a real shot at accelerating the transition meaningfully. At a regional level, Southeast Asia will need to see more collaboration on things like policy for renewable incentives and fossil disincentives, and on matters like shared infrastructure, including grid interconnectors. And that kind of cooperation will be even more critical if the region upgrades its net zero commitments. But that is a large and complex subject, and we don't have time to do it justice today.
And finally, what can Singapore as a leading bunkering, port, and shipping hub contribute to maritime decarbonization and the energy transition at large?
The contribution from Singapore can be, and in my view, will be pivotal to the energy transition in maritime. It is by far the world's leading supplier of maritime fuel, and there is a strong realization there at all levels in government and civil society that in order to keep this top spot, Singapore is going to have to lead the transition. We have already seen very large-scale and rapid changes in LNG bunkering, and I have no doubt that Singapore will lead the way in ammonia too. Given its geographic centrality, I should think that longer-term plans would also encompass a thriving hydrogen ecosystem where the port will not simply be trading hydrogen, but adding value to it by producing e-fuels. Building on Singapore's position as a leading refining center, what gives me most encouragement is that there is a strong tradition here of science-based and knowledge-based progress. An investment in the knowledge economy is the soundest and most sustainable investment of them all.
Thank you very much for your insights, Remy. And that was Remy Eriksson, the Group President and CEO of DNV, highlighting the many, many facets of the energy transition, which we will hopefully have the time to unpack during this conference. But two things really struck out for me there. He said, good news in the energy transition, and that is the focus on electrification and why we will need brave and strong political stewardship to make this energy transition a lot more bearable for all. He also ended on the note the important role that Singapore can play in this energy transition. So this is my signal to welcome our next speaker on stage. As the authority in the energy market, Jonathan Goh, the Director of External Relations at EMA, will be giving us an update on the Singapore's state of our energy transition. So let's welcome Mr. Jonathan Goh from EMA, please.
Thank you. Well, to all the DNV colleagues out there, welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation. We welcome this opportunity to be able to share, some perspectives of the energy landscape in Singapore. Now, the energy transition towards a net zero is not just a goal. It is a global imperative. It is a commitment to redefining how we produce, distribute, and consume energy. This transition is not confined to a single sector or industry. It is a shift that demands collaboration and innovation at every step. From cleaner energy generation and more efficient transmission to responsible consumption, each link in the value chain of the energy transition plays a pivotal role. It is also about sustainability and resilience. Now, Singapore has mapped out how we would achieve its net zero goal. Last year at the Singapore International Energy Week, or SIU, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Lawrence Wong, had announced that Singapore aspires to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We will do so by harnessing the 4 switches of natural gas, solar, regional power grids, and low carbon alternatives, which many of you will be familiar with. Today, I will be focusing on 2 of the switches, regional power grids and low carbon alternatives. On regional power grids, now the commencement of the Lao PDR Thailand Malaysia Singapore Power Integration Project, LTMS PIP, in June last year was a significant milestone for Singapore and ASEAN. The LTMS project is the first multilateral electricity trading in the region, which involves 4 countries. It is also Singapore's very first renewable energy imports. Now, I fondly recall that I was at this conference on 23rd June last year as my colleagues reported the first flow of electrons into Singapore in the afternoon. Now, the LTMS has started for a year, and it continues to play an important role to advance the ASEAN Power Grid vision of multilateral electricity trading, as well as to enhance the development of the renewable energy sector in Southeast Asia. Now, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, there is potential to increase the region's share of renewable energy to 65% by 2050, while concurrently reducing its share of energy-related carbon emissions by 75% in the process. Now, this is an exciting prospect as the LTMS ministers have recently expressed the support for the project to further evolve, to explore multi-directional trading arrangements. At the broader level, regional interconnectivity is key to unlocking the region's potential for renewables. When we advance connectivity, we are not merely joining power grids and infrastructures, we are forging connections between communities, nations, and strengthening economic and development opportunities. Now, this in turn supports clean energy transitions. By sharing resources and infrastructure, countries can tap into renewable energy sources more efficiently. Now, for instance, excess hydro or solar power in one area in the region can be transmitted to another when needed, reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Regional interconnectivity also enhances energy resilience and security. It enables neighboring countries to balance supply and demand more effectively, reducing the risk of blackouts and ensuring a steady flow of power even in times of crisis. Now, at the ASEAN level, regional interconnectivity has been an important topic of discussion and collaboration. There will be, and there have been a lot of discussions on furthering bilateral and multilateral interconnections in the region. Now, the collaboration between Keppel Electric and the Royal Group on the export of 1 gigawatt of electricity from Cambodia into Singapore is one such example. At the recent ASEAN Ministers on Energy meeting, the feasibility study for the Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines Power Integration Project, BIMP, PIP for short, was also announced. Now, Singapore and the United States are also embarking on feasibility studies on regional energy connectivity in Southeast Asia. Now, these long-term energy infrastructure projects present many opportunities for public and private sector collaboration. Now, let me now turn to low-carbon alternatives. Now, Deputy Prime Minister Wong launched Singapore's National Hydrogen Strategy at SEU last year. It is a roadmap of how hydrogen can support Singapore's decarbonization efforts and the steps we will be taking to prepare for a hydrogen future. Hydrogen is a promising clean fuel source that can support our objectives of reducing carbon emissions and safeguarding our energy security. Hydrogen does not emit carbon dioxide when it is used as a fuel, and it can be imported from diverse source countries, ensuring energy security. The National Hydrogen Strategy is outlined by 5 key thrusts. I'll go through them quickly. Now, first, Singapore will experiment the use of advanced hydrogen technologies. Now, we have launched an expression of interest for a small-scale commercial project on utilizing ammonia for power generation, including developing ammonia supply chains to also supporting maritime bunkering needs. Next, Singapore will also conduct research and development work to advance hydrogen technologies. Through collaborations between academia and industry, we aim to unlock key technologies so that Singapore is able to import, handle, and utilize low-carbon hydrogen and its derivatives safely and at scale. Third, Singapore will work closely with industry and international partners to enable the formation and scaling up of supply chains for low-carbon hydrogen. Fourth, Singapore will develop the land and infrastructure plans to support the import, storage, and transformation of hydrogen into power. Last but not least, which is an important one, Singapore will work with the industry and the education sector to support workforce training due to opportunities arising from supply chain financing, trading, certifying, transporting, storage, and development of hydrogen. By developing a hydrogen ecosystem in Singapore, we can reduce our carbon emissions and create new opportunities for economic growth and job creation. Hydrogen can help us decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors such as heavy industry and transportation and enable us to achieve our net zero goal. At the regional level, ASEAN and IRENA are developing exchanges on the study and capacity building on green hydrogen. Now, I believe that the DNV conference today will also discuss these important topics of regional power grids and low-carbon derivatives. And I look forward to hearing all the perspectives and ambitions on how we can deepen cooperation on this front. The energy transition presents a huge opportunity for all stakeholders to work together. It is a journey of collaboration, innovation, and shared responsibility. We thank the DNV leadership and colleagues for bringing us together here to share experiences and forge new partnerships. We hope the discussions today here will also contribute to the upcoming 16th Singapore International Energy Week, which will focus on energy transition towards a net zero world. And we look forward to welcoming all of you at SEW this year in October. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for sharing more on Singapore's national hydrogen strategy and our demand for, or the developments in regional power grids. And you can see there, Jonathan was proudly wearing the SEW badge. So be sure to not miss out SEW at the end of October. EMA also organizes SEW, by the way. Okay, so on that topic of power grids, one key highlight of the Energy Transition Outlook, or the ETO, is the demand for resilient and reliable power grids. And our next speaker will be shedding more light on this topic. Dr. Matthew Rowe, who is the head of Power Grids APAC at DNV, has published many articles on the subject in internationally recognized journals, and he often speaks at academic and industry conferences. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Matthew Rowe on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Rowe, and I'm the director of DNV's Power Grid business across Asia Pacific. It's brilliant to hear the EMA talking about their aspirations of what's going to happen across the region. So thank you, Jonathan, for sharing that with us. We're very fortunate to be working with the EMA across lots of different areas at the moment. And as such a forward-thinking regulator across the region, it means that they really challenge us and push us, and we can work together to make the region a more sustainable place. I wanted to start today with a quote from Bill Gates. And often our power grids are kind of forgotten about. We forget that our electricity just comes to our house, and we take that for granted. And what Bill Gates has noticed is that a lot of the attention goes on the generation side. So it goes on things like talking about solar and hydrogen and wind. And he says power transmission is key to our clean energy future. If we address the barriers standing in the way of that future, it will lead to lower emissions, cleaner air, more jobs, fewer blackouts, more energy and economic security, and healthier communities. So we're not just talking about power grids for no reason. Really, we can drive a greater system by getting this right. As Remy talked about, our energy system in the future will look really different than it is today, and there's some massive numbers up on the screen. Maybe you want to point out 1.3 passenger electric vehicles we predict to see in the system by 2050. And every year we publish our Energy Transition Outlook, which is our view of the future out to 2050. And it will look very different than where we are. This shows that 70% of our renewables will come from solar and wind out to 2050. And I always think the interesting thing here is if you look at where we are today in sort of 2023 and the shadowed area behind, really that's not seen a huge amount of change. What really is coming is where all the big change is. And that means that our grids need to operate in very different ways than they were ever used to before. And in fact, what we'll see is electricity. If you take all the ways in which we carry energy across the world, electricity will double in the total energy carrier mix out to 2050. So we will have twice as much electricity running through our system than we ever had before. And there's a couple reasons for this, but one of the biggest drivers is electric vehicles. And what we've actually seen is that we see peak emissions overall beginning to drop down, and at total energy use, and you can see that there, it sort of converges around 2030. And that's because electric vehicles use much less energy in total than a traditional internal combustion engine. And actually, in Southeast Asia, this is even bigger growth, and this is the fact that GDP and population growth are growing a lot across Southeast Asia. And you can actually see that across Southeast Asia, the share of electricity in the total generation mix will grow by 4 times what it is today, which means we need a much more reliable grid to get all this power running through our systems. You have two ways of building and upgrading power grids. We could make the cables bigger. We could just put more cables in the ground, but this is very expensive and very high carbon, and ultimately these costs get put right onto the consumer and us who are paying our bills. Or you can make the grid smarter, and you can use new forms of digitalization to advance how we operate our grids. So our grids are going to change, and I just want to talk about 4 different ways in which this is happening. The first is that because of all the electrification that we're going to see, and ultimately what this comes down to is we must electrify every part of the industry that we possibly can. But as a result of that, the system that we're going to have is going to be much more distributed than we had before. So you imagine we're very much used to having big coal or gas generators and a handful of them dotted around the country, while solar and wind and distributed sources on things like your house is much, much smaller. So we end up with lots of little things all the way around the world. And that makes things very difficult to control, because what we're used to is being able to tell the gas turbine to turn up or turn down. But actually, when it's windy and it's sunny, we can't control that. And so what we have to do is use much more advanced analytics. We no longer can have a guy in a control room switching a switch to tell things to turn on and off. We need to use these analytics and this data to make our system more intelligent. By having more power running through our grids, it means we're using grids, though, in a way that they were never designed. And a lot of these power systems were designed 50, 60, 70 years ago. And suddenly they're going to see loads of electric vehicles, everyone coming home from work, plugging them in and charging their cars. So we're going to need to run these grids much closer to their operating limits than we've ever had to before. I won't talk about interconnection, but interconnection at this point, but interconnection is a very key part. And we see that the European grid, for example, is a very resilient grid because of how well it's connected to other countries. And ultimately, what we can see is that we can lower the total cost of the regional grid across Southeast Asia by maximizing the potential of natural resources. So where we have places like Malaysia, for example, and we saw Malaysia launch its energy roadmap last week, where they have lots more space and lots of solar resources, actually being able to move that to areas where we have high demand, like Singapore, is a great potential example of where cross-regional grids can have a lot of potential. And what we're also beginning to see then, and outside ASEAN as well, is a lot more offshore wind coming on the system. Mingwei later, a colleague, will talk more about what's happening in offshore wind. But these are much bigger grids, and grids that require different ways of moving energy around. So, for example, where we're used to moving energy with AC energy, actually, once you start moving energy over very long distances, that becomes very inefficient. So we have to start using DC grids to make things more effective. At the moment, we have about 6 million circuit kilometers of cables around our world. And to make the energy transition happen, as Remy was talking about, to 2050, we see that we need to double that by 2050. I was invited by Jonathan and the teams to talk at a SU Connect event, which is an event focused on power grids recently. And it was amazing to see a sold-out room, a room that was full with people and overflowing just to talk about power grids. Someone who did their PhD and has worked in this area for a decade, that really excites me. But what we see is there's a big challenge at the moment with the cable supply chains around the world. So the raw materials that go into cables are not easy to get hold of. We've seen prices significantly increase. We see that there's not enough factories. We're seeing projects being booked in 5, 10 years in advance. And we need to work out how we can develop the supply chains for cables in order to deliver a system that's like that up to 2050. And in Southeast Asia, that's even more amplified because we want to see 4 times as many cables in our grid out to 2050. And it's the same with investments. At the moment, we invest between about 200 and 300 billion USD a year in our grids. And actually, as we go out to 2050, we expect that to reach about 400 or 500 billion. And the interesting thing is on digitalization is that we think around 15, maybe 20% of these total investments. This is a lot of money every year, 500 billion USD a year, 20% or 20% of that being spent on digitalization. So here we're talking about using advanced algorithms such as machine learning. We're talking about utility switching from a more reactive approach to how they manage their assets. So what we're used to seeing is assets slowly getting old or failing, and then we're able to go and solve the problems. But actually, by using predictive and preventative asset management techniques, by just having access to a lot more data and a lot more intelligence on how we use those assets, we can run our networks in a much more efficient way. We see much more interest on cybersecurity and the fact that our assets need to be much better prevented as they were before, as they're being more prone to attacks, and in general, just a lot more sensors collecting data around our systems. This year, we will publish a report on the ASEAN Interconnector project, which is some work we're doing to try and really show the value of a grid across ASEAN. This is something we're looking at presenting potentially at SEU in October, but really working closely with the industry to get feedback on what's useful. How can we help move this challenge forward? The final thing I want to share today is every year DNV publish something called our Energy Insights Reports. And this is what we do is we go away and we ask the industry some questions, and we get that information and we publish it. And this year we did it on our power grids and future-proofing power grids. And I just want to share 3 findings from that with you before I finish today. As part of this report, we interviewed about 400 people. 25% of these were from the sea level, and they represent about 75 countries around the world. The first thing that came out is 87% of people said there's an urgent need for greater investment in our power grids. And that varied by regional. So you can see in the plot there at the bottom that around 87–90% of people recognize this across Europe and North America. But actually in Southeast Asia, still 75% of respondents agreed with this. And I think this just represents where we are with our energy transition and journeys at the moment. Across Europe and the US, we see a lot more renewables going onto the system, and we see a lot more challenges, particularly with things like congestion and trying to actually be able to connect these assets to the grid. A lot of the time at the moment, we're trying to connect things like solar and wind to the grid in Europe and the US, but we just can't get it on the grid. There's just not enough room in the cables to put the power down. And we are not quite facing those challenges on the same scale at the moment as we are, which means that we can set up our grids in the right way today. Power grids cannot adequately connect renewable resources to areas of high demand, and I think this is great why the EMA are talking about this in Singapore. 76% of responders identified this as one of the challenges. And then we also asked people what their investment priorities are on the shorter term. And actually, it's quite interesting, because if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the key that we've used, so blue, green, and red. And red is for digitalization. I think if you asked this question before COVID, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you would not have had so many different options for digitalization as people seeing as their reason for their investment priorities. But the top one up there is integration of battery energy storage systems. And I'm going to present one more slide and talk about the role of energy storage within our power system today. This is actually my favorite topic, so I've got 2 minutes to talk to you about it. But ultimately, what's going to happen is as we have more solar and renewables on our grid, we just have less flexibility in our system. But we still have to find a way of matching our supply and our demand, which is very difficult, because if everyone gets home and they all turn their kettles on to make a cup of tea, you suddenly have this really big spike of demand, and you need to provide that generation from somewhere. And as we switch towards more solar and wind, it's very difficult because we can't control that. And so what we need to do is look at what assets we could put on the network to be able to solve this problem, and battery storage is one of them. Across lots of parts of Europe and the US at the moment, we're seeing a significant amount of batteries being deployed on the world. And these batteries are great because they can provide energy very quickly in very short periods of time. And the other problem is as we turn off gas and coal, which is very big spinning generation, and this spinning generation adds stability to our system. As we turn that off and we rely on things like solar and wind, we don't have that stability. And because batteries can respond so quickly to frequency deviations, they can provide a way of stabilizing the system. And you can see here, our expectations on what's going to happen are massive. So there's big growth on what's going to happen. And a lot of these batteries will be located with solar. And what we typically see is the duration of these batteries being sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe 5 years ago. But now actually much longer batteries, sort of 1 hour, 2 hours in duration, which means that they can provide energy to the system for 1–2 hours whilst we wait for maybe the clouds to come over or whatever the challenge is with the more intermittent intermittent renewables. And the other thing to mention is that because of all these electric vehicles that we have going across the grid, actually we see and we envisage at least 15% of these being used as a battery for the grid. So having some vehicle-to-grid technology, and there's some brilliant startups at the moment being developed to mature the vehicle-to-grid technology so that your car can play its role in supporting our system. So that's all I wanted to share today. Thank you very much for your time, and I really hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you. You know, your passion and enthusiasm for power grids is absolutely palpable. I mean, I sat over there and I totally felt it. So ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get more details about the latest power grids ETO, and to get some of the nuances and inputs from Matthew, I think he will be around during the coffee break and also at the reception at the end of the conference. Okay, so ignore that. Just focus on me for the time being, because we are going to discuss the really compelling theme of building up Southeast Asia's new energy future. As the world witnesses this very dynamic shift in the energy paradigms, Southeast Asia's energy transition becomes then a critical point in us pursuing more resilient and reliable energy systems. So our suite of speakers that's coming up on stage next will be discussing this very multifaceted landscape of the energy transformation in this region. Now, before I invite them on stage, this is the time where I invite my audience, both online and our physical audience, to participate in this upcoming conversation. So there you have it. The QR code is on screen right now. That's your opportunity to submit questions and to leave us some comments about this discussion about on building Singapore's or Southeast Asia's energy future. We will be launching a poll too, so do look out for that, because I would love to get your responses to that particular question on how we can bring down the cost of decarbonization as an industry. So just let me explain how that poll is going to work. When we launch it, there won't be any options for you to choose from. So it's kind of like one of those polls where you know the cloud, you just key in an answer that resonates most with you. We would really prefer one word or two, max 3-word answers, so that the most common answer will appear the largest on screen. Please do not write an essay. We will not have time to read it. So just big, impactful words, okay? So I'm just going to get that instruction out there before I invite them on stage. And it looks like I timed it perfectly. We can clap now. Yes. Thank you, guys. All right, joining me to discuss more about Southeast Asia's new energy future, please join me in welcoming on stage Mr. Yong Hui Chua, the Managing Director from Keppel Infrastructure. I'm also joined by Sean Gregory, the EVP of New Energy from Woodside Energy. And then we have Jane Liao, Vice President from CPC, and Brice Lagallo, the Regional Director for Energy Systems APAC at DNV. Welcome, everyone. Everyone's all mic'd up, sounding good. All right, ladies and gentlemen, our first panel for DNV's SETC 2023. This is your chance to pose them really difficult questions. I had a word with them earlier, and they said, bring it on. Right, guys? Yes. So to kick off this discussion, perhaps just give us a brief introduction about yourselves and how your organizations are responding to the energy transition. Let's start with Yong Hui. Then we'll go down the row.
All right, so very quickly, I'm from Keppel Infrastructure. I head up the new energy division within Keppel Infrastructure. So Keppel Infrastructure is a wholly owned subsidiary of Keppel Corp, and we have traditionally been in the gas to power business, waste to energy business, and district cooling business. A couple of years back, we started pivoting the business because energy transition is in front of us. So we started to do quite a few bold moves. We were the first to bring in the 100 megawatt LTMS, we call it the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore power import. 100 megawatt of hydro, that's not very big, but at least it's a bold move. It started the whole regional grid transition that we spoke about. Keppel has also been the first to bring in a hydrogen-ready combined cycle gas turbine into Singapore. So that project is under construction now. And we also started to move into carbon capture. With our waste to energy business, we started to do carbon capture projects, and we successfully piloted the project in Runcorn in Manchester. So energy transition is multifaceted, and happy to be part of this journey.
Happy to have you, and lots of things going on there for capital infrastructure. Thank you, Yong Hui. Sean.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So Sean Gregory, I lead our new energy division at Woodside Energy. We've been a provider of LNG for 40 years to the region. So we identified the energy transition sort of 5 or 6 years ago, and how is Woodside going to play its role in that. So ever since then, we've been building a suite of supply projects, both in hydrogen supply for the region, but also CCS projects to receive CO2 back. And then working closely with our existing customers and new customers on, how do we jointly integrate this supply chain to enable the energy transition. So that's what we've been up to at Woodside.
Thank you, Sean. Jane.
Well, I'm Jane Liao, CPC Corporation Taiwan, and CPC is a state-owned company. We are in charge of energy supply to my country, in particular in terms of LNG. We are the sole supplier. After COVID-19, everyone is talking about net zero emission by 2050. I personally are not that optimistic, in particular for a country like Taiwan and probably even the Japan and Korea. We are 98% rely on the energy imports. And when we are trying very hard to achieve that, take Taiwan as an example, is a little bit unique because by 2025, it's supposed to be the so-called nuclear-free country. So when we try very hard to catch up with that kind of goal, and suddenly after the COVID-19, the net zero emission coming. So it's a tough job, and everyone is talking about the sustainability, and if you cannot survive now, there's no sustainable future. But we are trying to catch up with Woodside, catch up with DNV, and even the CAPO, because it's quite amazing that I have learned CAPO now is quite advanced. They're involved in the so-called ammonia, MCH, and et cetera. So this is quite amazing. So today, thank you, DNV's invitation. I'm not here just to share our views, but I'm also here to learn from the industry how we are going to achieve that kind of net zero emission. It's kind of mission impossible, but still, it's a hope out there.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I like your candor. You're just putting it out there. Achieving those 2050 goals is going to be mission impossible, not very optimistic. Okay, let's just put it out there. It's probably on the minds of many too. Brice?
Yes, so I'm Brice. I'm responsible for our energy systems business here in Asia Pac. Energy systems, 2.5 years ago, we decided to merge our renewables and power and oil and gas businesses together to create a pool of energy experts with activities across the value chain. What do we do in DNV about the energy transition? Well, what we do is we have a vision that we would like to tackle global transformations. And today we see there's 2 major transformations happening. It's about digitalization and it's about decarbonization. And what we believe is that from our independent position, we're here to help accelerate the deep decarbonization. And very often people ask me, so what do you do exactly at DNV? You do so many different things. And if I try to summarize it in 4 different things, first of all, we try to answer, is it safe? Is it sustainable? Will it work? And is it compliant? And so when we sit down with our partners and the various stakeholders, we try to answer those questions and help the players to understand their risks and manage them in the future.
So you said there were two-pronged approach to how you guys do things, right? Utilization and decarbonization. I mean, those are the priorities. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you, Brice. Well, still on that thread of meeting goals that Jane brought up earlier, we had experts like the IEA and even DNV forecasting that we are not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global warming to well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're currently at 1.1 degrees Celsius already. So what do you think needs to be done to get us back on track? Let me circle back to Yonghui then.
Well, I'll say that most important thing to do is really to act, right? Don't
To act
wait.
now.
Act now, yes. Don't wait for the perfect solution. The perfect solution may not come. The energy transition is a very complex one because I personally do not believe that there is a one-size-fits-all or a one solution that will solve the world energy transition issue. You cannot just put solar panels and expect the issue to go away, or put wind farms and expect the issue to just go away. But I think it really requires different, multifaceted answer. And so I think it's important to just act. Don't wait for the perfect answer to come. Take small steps. And here again, I come back to what Keppel is doing. We try to bring in 100 megawatts of renewable from Laos. It's very small. It's a very, very tiny drop in the ocean in the whole energy transition landscape. But at least it punches, it's a pathfinder project, and it allows us to start the whole dialogue of setting up a regional grid. So act. I think act now. It doesn't matter whether it's a perfect solution, and there will never be a perfect solution. Just do it.
I like the word that you mentioned there, pathfinder. So you see yourself as a first mover?
Yes and no. In some aspect, yes, we will try to become a pathfinder. In the case of LTMS, we were the very first to bring in the power from Laos. In that case, actually, it was an easier project for us, in the sense that it really doesn't require a lot of upfront capex. In the other case is really the planting a hydrogen-ready CCGT, right? So we took the decision to plant hydrogen-ready CCGT, and the moment we announced that project, people went to the media and say, "So Keppel, where's your hydrogen coming from?" And my answer to them is, I don't know. I don't know where my hydrogen is coming from, but I know I want to get there. Right? I want to get there. I want to burn hydrogen. I want to burn low carbon hydrogen. But we took the step and said, okay, let's plant it first. The power plant will be there for the next 20, 25 years. Hydrogen will come. But at least somebody has to start seeding this kind of projects. If you don't take a first step, the industry will not move forward.
Thank you, Yonghui. And Sean, then, from an energy supplier's point of view, what do you think we need to do to just get us back on track to maybe still limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius by that timeline? What have you guys been doing?
I like the comment, don't let perfect get in the way of good. I think a lot of people are trying to find that perfect solution, and if it existed, we would have already implemented it. And it is a lot of hard work. The supply chains need all to be changed end to end to affect a transition, and that's going to take a long time. And I think a lot of people have this very near-term view. I want results, this year, this month, when it's actually not going to pan out at scale into the 2030s. So, to get us back on track, I agree, we've got to take steps now, and a good step is the step to take, not necessarily aim for perfection. I also think that I don't think we should just bet on one winner. That doesn't exist either. It's going to be a variety of solutions depending on the customer needs. And we work with very different customers in Japan and Korea to Singapore. We work with Keppel. We're also global, so what we see in the US is different to what we see in Europe. And it's not going to be solar for the world. It's not going to be offshore wind for the world. It's going to be hydrogen in liquefied form for some. It might be in ammonia for others. It might be batteries augmented with solar at scale for another customer. And don't criticize others. good. Everyone making a step forward is a good thing. And I think diversity to solutions is something that we should expect to see in the long run.
So do you have a diverse mix of solutions already in your pocket?
Yeah, so we've been, obviously being a long-term supplier of energy as an energy exporting country and company, we've had very long-term relationships with customers. And so we understand reliability of supply, safe, affordable, on time, and we see from those customers different requirements. Some we want to continue for a while to burn LNG and capture the carbon and send the carbon back. Fine, so we have CCS for that. Some are leaning forward and wanting to make a move into hydrogen in liquid form or as ammonia or as another innovative carrier. And so we leave the technology choice on supply open as long as we possibly can to work with those customers and then work with them as well on the infrastructure that's needed to connect the two, because I think that's something that we don't talk enough about.
Okay, let me come back to that point on infrastructure in just a while. Thank you, Sean. Then swinging back to Jane, you did highlight for us at the beginning how challenging it is, for CPC being the country's energy supplier to convert to the green path. Perhaps tell us what kind of solutions is CPC prioritizing now, because you oversee the overall decarbonization strategy for the company.
Well, basically, we will sing the same song with the global trend, say net zero emission by 2050. This is also government's policy. However, I think for people who have known me for a long time, and in fact, I'm from LNG business, even though I am now leading company's hydrogen task force team, I still don't like hydrogen. And I don't like ammonia or MCH, whatever. It was just a few years ago when we attended all kinds of conference. People were talking about, say, LNG or natural gas is the so-called rising star. Now the rising star being replaced by hydrogen. So I don't know, but I think a different country got different. How can I say? East Asian country, we are not endowed with natural resources. And I think this morning we have heard that, say, the South Asian countries, they don't just have the solar or the wind. They also have the natural gas and coal. They got everything. But for countries like Taiwan, Japan, Korea, we got nothing. So for the hydrogen itself, I think it's very tough job to move ahead, although all kinds of feasibility studies now are ongoing. But I still want to fully utilize our existing infrastructure and let the end user, they capture the carbon. And like Sean just mentioned, if CCS is doable or workable, then that carbon capture for CCS, that make more sense. Instead of, say, CPC or the LNG supplier, domestically, then we do the so-called SMR, the blue hydrogen, and do the carbon capture. But by doing so, we have to kind of renovate or have to replace all the existing transmission facilities, things like that, or the end user, they also need to convert their gas turbine to, something.
Too much work.
Yeah, exactly, and it's costly. That's why I don't like that. But that's the way we have to do. Several speakers, they already mentioned that it's very diverse. Yeah. We need to do many things. It's not just hydrogen or green hydrogen or ammonia or MCH.
Yeah, it is a multifaceted solution. And so your focus now is really to leverage on the existing systems that you have, the fleets, systems, and then do the carbon capture for the end user. Thank you, Jane. And just very quickly, Brice, then, the quick wins that just shift us back on track, what should we be focusing on now?
Well, actually, the fact that we're not going in the direction is something that is not new, and that's the main reason why we started to publish our pathway to net zero, not only focusing on how the future is going to look like, but also focusing on the solutions and key ideas there from our side. Number one, it's not something to be blamed on the lack of technology or the lack of finance. This is there on both sides. Second key idea is that, as what Sean was mentioning, is that there's no one size fits all. This will depend on which industry you're talking about. This will depend where you sit around the globe, and that's very, very important to understand. It is a complex phenomena, and therefore it's important to understand the dynamics between everything. So, key message from our side is everything that can be electrified, as Matthew mentioned before, needs to be electrified. That will give us a couple of wins. Number one is suddenly you potentially have access to green electricity. Second thing is that you really improve on energy efficiency, and that's really important. But then to get all, if we're able to get all the renewables that we want really scaled up, something needs to happen on the grid, not only on the grid, but also on the power models that we have. And that is also something that needs to be considered. And not everything can be electrified, obviously, and this is where hydrogen and e-fuels start to come in. But then the other aspect of it is what we're looking at. The focus is not carbon emissions. What we're looking at is temperature. We want to get the temperature to come down, and it's a global problem. And solving the problem in one part of the world, if the problem still exists in another part of the world, it's still a global problem. So that means that some places, some countries, or some industries will have to go much faster than others, or actually go negative, and this is where carbon capture comes into play. So when we look at Southeast Asia as a whole region, here it's even more complex because the energy demand is actually increasing significantly compared to the global average. Which means that here, the problem at stake is even more important, and that really requires even more collaboration than what we see today.
So given that the energy demand here is exponentially higher than other parts of the world, right? This being a very dynamic economic region. I understand that this particular industry, the energy industry, also has a very interesting conundrum, right? Like you said, there's just so much demand for electrification, electric vehicles, renewable energies, and then there's so many innovations taking place in terms of scaling up CCS, innovations in low-emission hydrogen. But then, yet, organizations still struggle to find a more economically viable business model that can attract enough capital to fund or deploy these projects. So what are some of the biggest barriers to deploying or securing or investing in low-carbon energy solutions besides cost? Now, this is the point where we want to invite our audience to key in your responses. What do you think is the best way to bring down the cost of decarbonization? So if you could scan the QR code and input your really impactful, I hope, one word, max 2, okay, max 3 word answer, and let us know what you think is the best way to bring down the cost of decarbonization. Is it a collective effort? As Brice just mentioned, we had alternative fuels. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in our second panel this afternoon. What kind of technology, if you're talking about technology, and is it about digitalization? So once again, the most common response will be the biggest one that we're going to flash up on screen, and then I'll get my panelists to weigh in on it. But for now, Yong-Hui, your thoughts. Decarbonization, how can we lower the barriers to this?
Well, I think the best way to lower the barrier is to learn by doing. We've got to start doing. The challenge...
So you have a very consistent message today, right?
Right,
Act now.
act now,
Learn
right?
by doing. Take action. Just do it.
Yeah, but it's not so straightforward. Right? I can tell you why is it so difficult. Just now I talked about LTMS. So that one really requires very little capital upfront, right? Because it's an existing grid, the interconnects are there. So the risk of participating in some of these projects are relatively lower. But imagine doing let's say, for example, a green hydrogen project. A green hydrogen project, a world-scale green hydrogen project, 2 gigawatt, 3 gigawatt. I mean, we're talking about close to $5 billion, $6 billion. And if you go to the board and say, okay, guys, give me the money for $5 billion to invest in the green hydrogen project, the very natural question that will come is, how are you sure that this project is bankable? And I want to differentiate this point is that And a lot of projects that we do, renewable projects, actually it is a local market. So if I do a solar panel, a solar farm, a wind farm, and I tie into an Australia grid, or be it an Indonesian grid or whatever, I'm selling to the local market. So long I have a feed-in tariff, I have some kind of CFD, I can make the project bankable because the power price is local. But imagine now I'm going to convert this into hydrogen and then put it into ammonia. And the moment I tell people, the moment I put this ammonia into a boat, I'm no longer fighting in the local market, I'm fighting in the global market. So how can I be sure that this ammonia coming from Australia or India or Middle East is globally competitive? And today, nobody can give a very straight answer, say, yes, because there is no global price for low-carbon ammonia. There is no clear marker yet. But we need to get there. If we don't get there, this pricing mechanism is not. So a lot of developers, myself included, we have been developing projects. We are testing the market. We're testing price. I'm a buyer, and I'm a developer myself. So I think I have a good view of the market pricing. But even that, I find it difficult to convince my board to say, guys, this price of ammonia, this is bankable. And this asset will not become a stranded asset. So the challenge, and I keep saying, move. Yes, it's important to move. But the question when it comes to this kind of big project is, do you want to be the first mover, or do you want to be a very strong number two? Because at the same time, also, DNV published reports, and you go to the industry, and industry reports come and say, electrolyzer technology is going to improve tremendously. It's going to improve multiple times in 2 years' time, 5 years' time. So why should I invest in first-gen, large-scale electrolyzers? Why don't I wait for a second-gen when I know that second-gen can be very competitive? So it's not easy, right? So I think the industry needs to somehow find a way to break this impasse. If we cannot break this impasse, we cannot move and we cannot start doing. Right?
Good point, Yonghui. So my question then to Jane and Sean, do you want to be a strong second or a first mover? And any advice to the board? How would you convince them to give you the go-ahead? Because he said he's had a hard time convincing the board, right? So any advice on that? Who would like to go first, either?
Well, I don't think we can become the so-called first mover because like Yonghui just mentioned, there's no international trading for ammonia or even hydrogen. So we are still waiting for some other, let's say, Japanese players for their liquid hydrogen vessel. That one is very important for the energy imported countries. So more or less the business model will be quite similar, between LNG and the liquid hydrogen in the future. So we are not in a position to become the so-called first mover. But for ammonia, I really don't know what is that for, that ammonia that Keppel is going to get involved. We need an off-taker. So even though you are brave enough to become the first mover, where is your downstream customers? The whole value chain is not yet there. So it takes time. But congratulations. You want to be the first mover. Just go ahead.
Thank you, Jane. Sean, your thoughts?
Yeah, so we're not afraid of being early for the right reasons, I guess. And, we're, as a big energy supplier, we do play a role in tackling, especially if there's some of the technology barriers to help get removed. But the barrier we worry about the most is the end-to-end simultaneous readiness of the supply chain. So for ammonia or liquid hydrogen, I don't really have too much issue getting supply ready. I could probably get the jetties and storage ready at my end, then the ships, and then having the jetties and storage at the receiving terminal, and then the final end consumption and how that's going. And every individual part of that supply chain, there's probably a solution. Are they all going to be ready and FID'd with their respective boards at the same time so that we all are ready for startup on January 1st, 2030. That to me is the biggest barrier, and the more people are just stepping back waiting, the less likelihood we're going to get that supply chain, and why we kind of work with as many as we can on different solutions to kind of get that end to end, because it will be for ammonia, it's liquid hydrogen and CO2, it makes no difference on the product. That integrated supply chain needs to be ready at the same time. And I think the common word in that word wall, which I totally agree with, is collaboration. And that's the collaboration I mean, it's collaboration to get the supply chains end-to-end complete.
End-to-end readiness would be your current biggest barrier. So let's bring up the word chain. Yeah, as Sean mentioned, the word cloud. Can we just bring it up on screen, please? I caught collaboration was the biggest word there. And then under that, we have technology, collective efforts, a collective effort, collaboration, and scale, and even a carbon tax. You guys are not bad. You kept to my 3-word max instruction. Very good. Brice, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, and I think I'd like to talk about the scaling side of things and link it to the supply chain effect that Sean was mentioning. If you look, for example, at the offshore wind industry, where here what we need is really for it to scale and scale very, very fast. I think one of the barriers that goes against all this is actually the lack of two things. It's the lack of standardization. In order to get, for example, the cost to go down, the size of the turbines are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and therefore that means that every time the turbine gets bigger, then it has an impact on the whole supply chain, and that ultimately it makes it very difficult for the developers to plan ahead and to be sure that the supply chain will be ready for the whole thing to work. And then about collaboration, again on wind. This is a local business, yes, but the resources are not infinite. What we see is that the development are actually competing with other parts of the world, with the incentives that we see in the US, the incentives that we see in Europe. It's very important that we don't only look at offshore wind development at national level, but we start looking at it at regional level, maybe share a few strategic plans in terms of regional supply chains in order to be able to compete to that market and to get the project size to increase, because what developers need is predictability, and if we only look at the long-term goals and not able to kind of have very clear targets on a yearly basis, it's not going to scale as fast as what we want.
Yeah. So that's a very strong reinforcement of Sean's point there. Thank you, Brice. Just a gentle reminder to my audience, both physical and online, that you can submit questions and we will get to them before we wrap our panel. So while we wait for the questions to trickle in right there, I want to talk about regulations and policy. What have you all observed in terms of the regulations and policies that are supportive of these net zero ambitions? I mean, you operate in very different markets here. So, for example, for Yonghui, bringing in the LTMS and doing that sort of project, you work across different markets, different suppliers across the supply chain, also different governments to get the permits going. What do you think governments need to do more of to encourage investments in this sort of new technology or green energy?
Right. So I mean, adding to what I mentioned just now, do you want to be the first mover, or do you want to be a strong number two? To break this impasse, I think the government has a very big role to play. The government, as the only entity that's sovereign, that has that kind of pocket that can seed an industry of this scale. So it's important that the government makes that first move to get the whole industry moving. And here, I think if we talk about energy transition, we cannot not talk about US IRA. So the US IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, although it is not designed specifically for energy transition, it's such a big elephant in the room. It's so big, so massive, that it fundamentally changes the cost curve for export from the US. And I personally see that as a very positive move, because it's starting to show ripples across the industry. All right, it's no longer just a US initiative. So other countries are starting to move, because If you do not move, you will fall behind. This is a strategic race to dominate energy transition. So you see that Australia has come forward. Australia has initiated this hydrogen head start program, $2 billion. It's not a lot, but it's still something. India has come forward. MNRE has instructed SECI to go to the market to procure hydrogen. And I understand that India is now thinking of a mandate, a green hydrogen mandate. That means if you are a producer of urea or fertilizers, you need to buy a certain amount of green hydrogen. And seeding demand, right? That will help break this impasse. And hopefully, like what Sean and the rest are saying, is really to break this and get the industry moving. So I think the government has a very important role to play here.
Thanks, Yong-Hui. Sean, yes.
Yeah, obviously we've got global projects and have projects in the US, and I find the Inflation Reduction Act a funny name because what it has done is increased inflation there. But it was very smart in that it didn't pick technology winners as well. I think it introduced, none of this green, blue, and colors of the rainbow. It was all about carbon intensity. So it just said, show me the data. So it did a good job on incentivizing. I think where it misses and they're looking to add now is demand stimulation. So I think is what can other countries learn is that you need both a stimulus on supply and demand. I think, and I saw in the word wall, the whole carbon tax, yeah. I think the world is increasingly realizing that one of the most efficient ways to generate energy is actually from LNG, and we're going to go backwards to go to hydrogen on efficiency. Why would you do that? Well, it's because it's got zero carbon. So, you have to value in some way the reduction in carbon. And one way to do that is the carbon tax. So I can understand why that's on there. You need to recognize the value balancer here is the carbon tax. And I think the third one for governments is recognizing around this issue around first movers are all kind of, to some degree, don't want to be the first mover because you're going to get penalized as technology curves drop, and then you're left with an uneconomic project. Well, let the first ones get the contract for difference. So governments that are offering contract for difference, that is designed to incentivize that end-to-end supply chain and the penalty you're going to take to be that first mover. So, where you see all three of those, that's where those first big projects are going to be, is my view.
That's a really great suggestion. I saw Yong-Hui nodding there. I was like, yeah, give me none of the penalty, but yeah, just give me that. Give me the incentive. Yeah, I'll be the first mover. And then Jane is like, yeah, just go for it.
Well, I think both Yong-Hui and Sean mentioning, in my view, it's not the so-called regulation, but it's, well, at least that's just the government's policy, because that's the first tier that you provide, like IRA, you provide some incentive. This is the first tier regulation. What I'm thinking about the regulation is something related to how you are going to promote or facilitate the hydrogen business or whatever. The whole supply chain and each sector, you need a certain regulation for that kind, in particular for the safety issue. So I don't know, it really takes time. The governments now only set up the policy, very clear out there. And some countries probably they already have that roadmap or whatever, but I don't think all the regulation needed for different sectors not yet there. And in fact, I really appreciate like Indonesia and China, they have their policy is not 2050 but 2060. I think that will be more realistic in my view, but whether it's quite debatable anyway.
I was going to say, Jane, that I really like your voice on this panel today because you're my realist, and then you just highlighted the 2060 timeline, which is obviously a lot more realistic. Thank you, Jane. Brice, do you think it is about reducing that complexity and permits when it comes to allowing the faster deployment of some of these projects or investments?
Definitely, some processes can can be simplified, really definitely. And I think one of the areas that we see where we see large barriers is the strong will of looking at every new project as a new project. That means that not necessarily using the learning from other parts of the world when wanted to deploy in a new part of the world because of local specificities. So standardization, I think if we really want to implement things as fast as possible and really for it to scale, especially in the wind sector, for example, we need to learn on what we learn in other places. And although there are some specificities in every local places, and here in this part of the world, typhoons and earthquakes are very important, and we're providing answers to that, using international standards as much as possible will definitely help us with scaling up the systems. And unfortunately, we don't see enough of that. We are spending a lot of time discussing with different stakeholders in many countries, try to advocate for this. But it's taking a lot of time, we think.
Yvonne,
Yeah.
can I have the privilege to ask
Yes,
questions?
of course. Yeah, go
The
ahead.
question is to Brice. You have mentioned twice, at least for that standardization. And so, well, different developers, probably they claim themselves, I am the standard. So who will lead this industry to become the so-called standardization in your view? DNV?
Yeah.
First mover, always lead the
No,
standard.
no, no.
I'm kidding.
No,
We
no,
prefer
I
to
don't
be
think
the
the first
follower,
mover is the one. But I do agree with Brice that there needs to be a standardization. For example, hydrogen or ammonia, we talk about all different colors, blue, green, and how do you price it? At the end of the day, I think the industry should stop talking about blue or green hydrogen. We just give it a carbon intensity, right? How many kg per kg of ammonia, how many kg carbon, and set the standard. So I liken it to, let's say, Newcastle coal, right? Newcastle coal is the price marker for coal in Asia Pacific, other than Qinhuangdao. So Newcastle coal has a certain calorific value. So set that price, that is the marker. And then you do adjustment, right? So if the calorific value of the coal is lower, higher than the Newcastle, you do a price adjustment. So set a standard. 1 kg per kg hydrogen, for example, this is the price, this is the marker, set it, so that it starts to be able to trade. Then everybody can start adjusting. So if my hydrogen is 2 kg per kg hydrogen, or if my hydrogen is 0.5 kg, then I'll price a premium or a discount accordingly. So I think standardization is very important to allow for a price marker to be discovered.
Sean, do you want to chime in on this debate on standardization?
Just 2 points. I really love that idea right, around just setting that price marker on the data, and I think that the IRA, like I said, set a good direction that way. And I also think it stops a lot of the time, you know, don't let good get in the way of perfect. Right? Everyone wants 100% solar input into my hydrogen. I'm like, okay, but it's going to be really, really expensive, and then people can't afford it. So I think that's a much better idea. I think the other one on standardization is and regulation is on the safety side. We again are not talking about that enough as we introduce new fuels into the mix, ammonia and liquid hydrogen, setting the safety regulations of these. You know, as again a long-term energy supplier, we take pride in that, and we worry when new entrants. We enjoy seeing new entrants to the market, but they don't have the process safety backgrounds that we do. So we need to set regulation in that space. To
So
Well,
protect
not
I'm
everyone.
not
forgetting
sure
safety.
if I take it wrongly, but my understanding from Brice standardization is something like the turbine, the wind farm, the wind turbine is supposed to be similar.
I think
or
it's a
something like that.
combination.
It's
I think
not
it's a
the
combination of
regulation
everything.
got to be standardized. It's just different.
I think different types of standardizations,
Yeah,
obviously,
exactly.
right? So different paradigms there, but you need all of it to happen to just make sure that the energy transition actually takes place. Okay, we have one audience question. Please bring it up. Okay. How is Southeast Asia prepared for the energy transition at large to overcome hurdles with varied economic growth priorities of different ASEAN countries? Wow, that is a long question. We have time for one. So who on the panel would like to take on this question?
So my perspective is certain countries and certain companies are better prepared, and I think you'll see that they'll take those first steps and kind of blaze the way, the pathfinder. And I think there's a lot of other governments that are really leaning in and wanting to see that progress. I think that there'll be a snowball effect ultimately, but it won't be until we get closer to the 2030s.
As an observer of the markets then, Brice, are there particular governments here in ASEAN that are already a couple of steps ahead?
Well, I think being in Singapore, we are in a great place where people are taking quite a lot of foresight on their future. So to name one, that would be my answer.
Any other comments for this question, anyone?
I think that energy transition might take much longer than we expected. And
Again, my realist in the room, it's going to take a long time, guys.
well, that's real life. We have to come back to real life anyway. But it's a hope out there, a very rosy picture, and we need someone to color.
Well, we got to stay optimistic, right? So on this optimistic note, then I'm going to wrap this panel by asking you this question. What is on your wish list when we talk about a fully decarbonized energy landscape for Asia, right? The topic of this panel was building Southeast Asia or Asia's energy future, new energy future. So what do you think that will look like? Let's start with Brice first and come down.
Can we think quite? Can we be
Beyond 2060 then? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And I think what would be wonderful, and that would answer the question that was asked, in having an ASEAN strategy would really be something that I think creates a huge difference for all the different countries, would probably help with scaling much faster and get the cost down much quicker. So
An
having
ASEAN strategy.
That would be, in my view, that would be a wish.
ASEAN strategy for energy.
Yeah.
Okay. Jane, your wish list?
That's very difficult, you know what, because I've been keep thinking about the ammonia things, because when we approach some very potential supplier, I mean, in terms of green hydrogen in the future, they've been thinking about, say, phase one is only for ammonia, but their ammonia, in fact, is coming from hydrogen. So hydrogen, and then ammonia. And when you receive the ammonia, you got to do the cracking to get the hydrogen. That's the reason why I make people so busy, you know. This is not very logical. This is my argument with all the my visitors or the suppliers. But anyway, just leave it there. People like this kind of job, say. So that's the reason why they can create so much.
So your wish list is?
Is let's pray.
Oh, okay. Just keep praying. Sean, praying that we'll get there. Okay, so that's your wish list. All right, okay. Sean.
So probably two things. I think the valuing of the low carbon fuel,
Okay.
and the ability to trade carbon across borders.
Trading carbon across borders. Thank you, Sean. Yonghui.
So maybe 2 points. One is to address Jane's comment that it's very strange to be converting hydrogen to ammonia and then ammonia and then crack it back to hydrogen and then you burn it. I mean, it sounds strange. 50 years ago, it sounds strange when we liquefied natural gas and then regasify it. So I compare it, LNG, to ammonia. At some point, we need some kind of energy that we can store, not at the gigawatt hour level. I mean, not for 30 minutes, not for 60 minutes, but something that I can store, low carbon, that I can store for months. And I think, I don't know whether ammonia is the right carrier, but that's something that we need to think about. So my wish list, if really to help accelerate this decarbonization, is pricing markers, because I think that's the only way to get the industry to move. Because if there's a target to shoot for, because let's say for example LNG, there's Brent, there used to be a JKM marker. Would there be a similar marker for low carbon fuel? If there is, that creates this target for the industry to work towards. So we know how to price it, and we know whether we are competitive, and the industry will take off. Today, where I think the industry is struggling to do projects is because there isn't a liquid marker out there yet.
Price markers.
Price
All right. So I want to thank Brice, Jane, Sean, and Yonghui for sharing your insights on the strategies, the policy imperatives, and the innovations that will help us chart the course towards a greener and more energy-abundant future in Southeast Asia. Clearly, with the right fundamentals and the action taken, we can hopefully look forward to an energy future where there's an open market for us to trade carbon, where there are very clear price markers, where there is a very high level, also a very clear ASEAN strategy for our region, and we gotta just keep praying that it will happen. So how about a big round of applause, please, once again, for my panelists for panel one. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the panel discussion because I did, very much so. Before we go for a break, I will want to invite my next speaker on stage, and he is Chung Ming Hui. He's the segment lead of Offshore Wind APAC at DNV Energy Systems, and he's going to give us a very timely update on the development in the offshore wind space. He has a decade of experience working the solar and the wind industry, and has also worked on many renewable energy projects, including those in Taiwan. So let's welcome Chung Ming Hui, please.
Very good afternoon, everybody. I kind of wish that I was before the panel because they have covered most of the key points. I think the key, spoiler alert, key point was on collaboration, how the need for collaboration is key. And I thought this would be a good time just before the break. I always have very bad luck about timing. So I'll try to keep this as short as possible. The key idea here is to plant ideas and also to have some figures so that we can discuss further during the break, so that I don't hold back your time. Without further ado, let's look at this. And this is really looking at the APAC region. You will see here through the lens here, a very old offshore wind farm, probably about 20 years ago. And the key thing that I want to mention here is that the wind farm today looks very different. So I just now Googled, Conrad is about 150, 160 meters high. Currently, the largest turbine that are commonly being used is about 150, 160 meters high in terms of hub height, plus about a 100-meter blade. That would put us at about 260 meters. So just imagine buildings that's the size of Marina Bay Sands out in the open sea. So one might argue that, in the first place, we have already been doing a lot of sophisticated oil and gas projects, but this problem that we face in the offshore wind is not about the scale. It's not about the size. It's actually about the scale of the projects that we will see. If you recall Matthew mentioning about the wind farms that we will see, 5,000 offshore wind farms, and just imagine each of these wind farms would have turbines that are the size of Marina Bay Sands. That's the scale that we are looking at today. And indeed, as Brice mentioned just now, the key to all this is actually collaboration. And I'm here to share some of the key unique insights about what's happening in the region. So why Asia Pacific? You will see that we have also offices across different markets. And I like to just summarize it. Where there's offshore wind, there's a DNV office. So if you have any problems, please feel free to come to me or any of my team members in the regional team as well. And the key thing is that APAC is one of the key important regions for offshore wind. You will see in the most recent report for GWAC that was just published last week, so I had to update all my slides thanks to GWAC, that you will see installations overtaking the European side as well as the US side already taking place. Now we do have total offshore wind installation by region that is expected to exceed the other markets as well. And some of the big names that you will see here would include China, Taiwan, Japan, even Australia, Vietnam are expected to play a very important role as well. So, as I mentioned, it's not just about the region itself. We also need to bear in mind that not just for new developments in the offshore wind market in Asia Pacific is also the supply chain. As Brice mentioned, it is important to consider the region as a supply chain hub because there are a lot of synergies and it just doesn't make sense to have all these factories in each of the countries that are having offshore wind farm. The key thing then becomes how do we keep up with the supply chain if we are looking at 5,000 wind farms 20, 30 years down the road? Who's going to supply all the equipment? Where is all the grid infrastructure going to come from? And that's where Matthew brought about a good point about the regional interconnectors, and that needs to be something that we plan now. So, a deep dive into the APEC, you will see, of course, no surprise, China playing a very important role and steady progression among all the different countries. This also shows that each of the countries and regions actually have already their master plan on how to roll out offshore wind because they see it as one of the core pillars. And it's not just offshore wind, because it's also the infrastructure that's required. It's also the tapping onto the hydrogen portion, including energy storage as well. So all that needs to take into consideration. And also one key thing that since this particular topic is about maritime as well, we do need a lot of installation vessels. Just look at the slides that we have previously, and you will see that we are indeed having a large shortage in terms of installation vessels, and the yards are not building enough to cater to the supply chain boost. And why is that so? Because there are a lot of delays in the project itself, and with delays, originally your vessel that was planning to do your wind farm could be then allocated to other wind farms. As a result, those countries and also regions that rely a lot on European vessels could find themselves in much of a problem because those vessels that were originally earmarked for their projects could be involved in other projects in Europe or in the US where they pay better rates and stuff. Now, one of the regional collaboration example that I can share with you guys would be, for example, a wind farm in Taiwan. You would actually have the offshore substation that's assembled in Singapore itself, and that's quite common that you see. And this really shows that even though places like Singapore do not have any offshore wind, when I tell people that I'm in the offshore wind business based in Singapore, people look at me and laugh. I have that face, that frown for the past 12, 15 years that I've been in offshore wind. But the perception has slowly increased, changing as well, because more and more people are exposed to offshore wind and the benefits and also the technology that it brings as well. And just to snapshot for a sample project in Taiwan, you have your jackets that's assembled, also fabricated in Taiwan. You have your jackets coming also from Korea. You have a possibility of getting towers manufactured in Vietnam. You have pin piles coming from Malaysia, offshore substation assembled in Singapore itself. And this really shows there's no point in setting up factories, for example, turbine manufacturing factories, in each of the locations because the region can work together. And the key benefit is that the moment you look at it from an APEC perspective, the piece of the pie becomes more interesting for the investors. It becomes more interesting for the supply chain as well because a lot of effort and money goes into boosting and building new supply chains. My colleagues and I were in Australia last week. We were also discussing about the need for local supply chains and also how we're going to solve this problem if Australia also were to come online in the next few years. So what about floating wind, which is something that we have not really covered? I don't really have much time, but the key thing is that if you have any further queries or so would like to understand more, you can download our report that highlights one of the key focus. But here, with the last few things, I want to say that offshore wind, we are not the only ones that are using the space. You have also your tourism, you have also desalination, ocean energy, shipping, fishery, marine aquaculture. And offshore wind is not just the same as well because we do have other activities that are happening in the ocean space. So therefore, it's very important that we have collaboration, not just within offshore wind, but also with the other industries as well, much so for fishing activities as well, which is one of the key stakeholders for offshore wind developments. Now, the key highlights and also trends that we see is that, number one, you do need to have a long, stable policy roadmap in place. If not, people would tend to look elsewhere. And this can be seen from Vietnam's Power Development Plan 8. When it was delayed for 1.5 years, there wasn't any much activities going on for offshore wind because everybody was waiting to see what will happen. So investors do go for stable policies and also stable roadmaps that you see. The more obvious you have for them, the better for them to roll out and also decide whether to invest. Number two, cost is indeed going down. There's no doubt about it. But in order to optimize the cost, as Brice mentioned, we do need to focus on standardization. And in this case, standardization does, at some point in time, look at technology as well. For example, for floating technologies itself, there are currently a lot of different technologies out there. A lot of concepts for the floaters, and therefore you do need standardization so that you don't change your manufacturing process when you go from one yard to another. We also need to look at the infrastructure, and this is not just for the grid infrastructure, this is also looking at ports. The number of ports that you need, the dimension of the ports that you need as well is very different for fixed and floating. So therefore, the master plan for developing ports does need to take into consideration the future expansion. As I mentioned before, we are looking at 2 megawatts 10 years ago. Now we are looking at 15. Even some of the turbine manufacturers are challenging the 20 megawatt range. So we do need to have bigger ports and also the infrastructure as well. What happens if we don't have enough ports? Could we then look at yards as one of the possible solution to this? And I think that needs to be further discussed with the various stakeholders as well. We do need to also look at this local supply chain as well as having an experienced workforce, and therefore it is important that we educate and also to upscale the different resources that are required. Interconnection and also transmission has already been covered by Matthew, so I'm not going to touch on that as well. International financing. I think one of the common trends is that we do see a lot of corporate PPAs coming up in Taiwan. Will that be the norm, and how will that be financed? And with mention of a contract for difference, for example, Sean mentioned about that, different countries are still having different regimes. So you have your FIP, feed-in premium model in Japan, you have your SMP plus REC in Korea. How does this all play? I think that needs to be considered as well. And it's not just compared to onshore wind. You have your ECAs, export credit agencies, that are involved as well, and that really complicates things as well. And lastly, I already mentioned about this. You do need to take into consideration the installation vessels, as well as the O&M vessels that need to go into play. The key challenge here, ultimately, is all related to costs. How do we make all this happen? And I think the solution to this is really about collaboration, and we need to talk more. So with that, I end my presentation for today, and I look forward to having fruitful discussions with you at the coffee break.
Thank you very much, Ming Hui, for that concise update. So collaboration to bring down cost. I think that's going to be our resounding theme for SETC 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go for a short break. We love to see you back here at 4 p.m. because we're going to switch tracks and move into the maritime decarbonization space. So please enjoy. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you. Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the DNV SETC, the second half, and this is what I would like to call the Maritime track, and we're going to get some updates on the maritime decarbonization. So, Mr. Knut Orbeck Nielsen, the CEO of DNV Maritime, will be taking up this segment. He has over 25 years of experience in maritime management and in international experience working in this sector. So he will be in Singapore to join us for Gas TAC later this week. But for now, he's going to leave us with some of his thoughts on the immediate actions needed to accelerate maritime decarbonization. And he will be dropping some hints from DNV's maritime forecast to 2050. So let's take a listen. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's no time to waste. We must move faster. Shipping leads the world in terms of transporting cargo, connecting markets, and empowering global trade. But when it comes to the environment, we must improve further. The challenges are not new. We've been talking about them for some time now, but the urgency is accelerating. The clock is ticking louder on efforts to identify, define, and resolve barriers to successful and safe decarbonization. The IMO's new goals from MEPC 80 require a 20% reduction in emissions by 2030, ramping up to net zero emissions by or around 2050. This is a significant acceleration welcomed by many stakeholders, but leaving the maritime industry with a grander challenge. For sure, the maritime energy transition is underway. But while it is encouraging to see that around half of new builds in 2023 are for ships capable of running on non-conventional fuels, the reality is that over 90% of the global fleet still runs on fossil fuels. This tells us that we need to do more to meet the decarbonization ambitions, and we have to move faster. Decarbonization is a complex puzzle, and we are still trying to put the pieces together in the best possible way. The best strategy will depend on different factors such as vessel size and trading patterns. Yet, pragmatism and a defined pathway for the vessel's life will be key to avoiding unattractive or stranded assets. We face the reality that carbon-neutral fuels will be expensive and in scarce supply. And so we need to also look beyond just fuels and seriously consider how we can use less energy. Later this week, we launched this year's Maritime Forecast to 2050. One of its key focuses is the importance of energy efficiency measures. Energy efficiency is nothing new, of course. Adjustments like speed reduction, route optimization, and hull and propeller cleaning are already proven methods. And these are being steadily improved with the aid of better technology and digitalization. But we need to go further. A 20% reduction in emissions by the end of this decade. It means that taking energy efficiency to the next level. Wind, the original fuel of the maritime industry, is making a comeback, with several ships once again harnessing this great power and reducing their reliance on traditional fuels. Other energy efficiency technologies are available, and it's up to us as leaders of the maritime industry to explore them in as much detail as possible. Let's leave no stone unturned in seeking the best options. Each technology is on its own journey and will have its own set of social, economic, and technical barriers to overcome. While the idea of new, modern sails harnessing the wind reminds us of the golden age of maritime exploration hundreds of years ago, other technologies like nuclear propulsion or onboard carbon capture and storage may seem like a pipe dream. Nonetheless, we need to be open-minded. We need to be brave. We need to show a willingness to explore all options on the table as we face up to what is surely the biggest challenge ever facing our industry. We must collaborate, share ideas, test them out, engage widely throughout the value chain, working together to achieve a common goal. As an industry, we need to embrace initiatives like green shipping corridors. They bring together key stakeholders across the value chain to collaborate, test different approaches, and identify and overcome hurdles, with the potential to inspire global action. Crucially, these kinds of projects provide us with knowledge, the most valuable currency for the journey that lies ahead. The maritime renaissance is truly on its way. Action taken and plans put in place now will impact the direction of shipping for years to come. This is the decisive decade for shipping. Let's get to work.
And that was Knut Orbeck Nielsen, the CEO of DNV Maritime. Again, a call to action, collaboration, and getting to work. So acting now. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to make a very quick announcement that someone has lost a small brown leather wallet with cards. So if you happen, it was lost in this ballroom. So if you happen to see one on the floor that was swept under the chair by incident and it doesn't belong to you, please just pass it on to the AV guys and they will find the owner of the lost wallet. Thank you. Now, we're going to expand on the maritime blueprint for Singapore. So I'd like to invite our next speaker, the Assistant Chief Executive of the Maritime Port Authority of Singapore, Mr. Kenneth Lim, on stage, please, to give us an update.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about the maritime transition. It's a good lead up from the earlier session from energy to shipping. I think these two are now getting closer and closer to working together. So I think just give audience who are from the energy sector a quick context that the shipping industry in Singapore is also very vibrant and very competitive in terms, these are some of the results for 2022, handling about 37.3 million TEUs. And of course, we're going to build our Tuas port at 65 million TEUs. We also mentioned about the bunkering hub. So this is why Singapore plays, we want to play an active role because as a bunkering hub, we do want to support many of the ships that calls on Singapore. This chart, I think many would have seen, and therefore no need for me to elaborate, but I think what I wanted to highlight is the Singapore's role in this area. So Singapore plays the role of vice chair of the MEPC at IMO. So I saw my team going up there for 2 weeks, negotiating with different country members and getting to that revised target was a good milestone. Setting also milestones target for 2030, 2040 sets work for many years. And Singapore will also be the chair for the steering committee looking at all the emission and economic measures that is going to be report back to IMO by end of next year. So Singapore wants to take action and play an active role in supporting at the IMO level. And back home, as a flag state, so I think that's also Singapore want to advocate a strong, credible, and inclusive climate change, taking guidance from the IMO. So you see here all the various activities and milestones that we have, whether it's in the standard setting, we talk about standard setting is important. We talk about the bridge builder, getting various economies to look at the carbon footprint and the international projects that we can work together, and of course to advocate for the climate action, both locally and at the IMO level. All right. So when we understand how carbon accounting is going to work, so first you have the domestic carbon accounting, then you have all the maritime carbon accounting that is reporting to IMO, and aviation, reporting to the ICAO. So if you have air, sea, and the land, that's in total going to sum up very much the carbon footprint of the world. And that is why Singapore needs to play 3 roles, one in the domestic area. And as my colleague in EMA have already shared, DPM Wong has already announced the 2050 target late last year. And in the Maritime, this is where then the port, which is considered as the domestic carbon emitter, will have to start planning out what are they going to do for 2030, 2040, 2050. And many of the initiatives here will lead to the net zero target. For the international, as a bunkering hub, the support for international shipping will be coming under the IMO, and this is where a few years back we already started working with the Class Society, with NTU, with all the research community to look at the different pathway where shipping owners, operators are looking at the various fuel type. So Singapore's, our stand will be, we need to be a multi-fuel port. We are supporting the international shipping, and therefore we need to support multi-fuel. And then we'll continue to look at the steps in terms of making the steps to handle and to ensure that the fuel that we're going to support will be safe in terms of the way we do bunkering in Singapore. You may have heard that we have done the methanol bunkering early this month, in August. Later I will have a slide on that. But in terms of this ammonia, you find that EMA and MPA now starts to need to come together, right? Because it is both for the energy consumption as well as for the shipping. So beyond the IMO level, within Singapore, the whole of government approach to the low carbon and hydrogen strategy will require different government bodies to work together. And this is an example of where EMA and MPA works together on the ammonia EOI. Then we talk about the electrification of hovercraft. So early this year, we have already announced that by 2030, every new hovercraft that comes on board has to be fully electrified or 100% biofuel or any net zero carbon fuel. So that's already been announced. That set the stage for our hovercraft community to work towards this net zero, this area of electrification of hovercraft. So if on the screen you see that besides just stating this is the timeline for everyone to go on full electrification, play the role of a facilitator. So we have launched the expression of interest for industry to come forward with the best design. So if you want to, we talk about efficiency. If you want to have your hovercraft to be most energy efficient, you need to rethink about the design. So that is on the proposal for new design. Then we also need the charging points to be ready. So that is the other expression of interest where we ask to look at trial charging points for electrification of our hovercraft. Right. Then earlier this month, late last month, we actually had methanol bunkering in Singapore. That's the first methanol bunkering in Singapore. And it takes us quite a few months to get ourselves ready for it because, in the new fuel, one of the concerns that we have is no longer an oil spill. It is more than an oil spill. It is a plume cloud. It is in gaseous state. And when the gas flow back into the island, that's not something that we will take it lightly. So there's a lot. On your right-hand side, you see all the modeling that we work with the research institution to make sure that the operation are done in the safe manner, considering the wind direction, the current of our waters in our port waters, and all that aspects will take into consideration before we allow the bunkering to happen. So you see that, again, all these various mechanisms are being put in place MPA staff also went through the firefighting course to make sure that we are now familiar with if there is a leak and if there is a fire out of methanol. It is really quite invisible flame. How are staff going to know and how they're going to fight fire for the safety of the vessels and of the people around them. So many of these equipments are used to safeguard the And then the next step for the methanol bunkering is to do the technical reference for methanol bunkering. So that after we learn together with our colleagues from the industry, we need to formulate the standards so that we can then publish that as a Singapore standard for methanol bunkering and more trials to validate these standards. And this will be the process in which we will take to look at other type of fuels. So this, for supporting the joint industry projects, these are all the various other forms, electrification and biofuel trials that are happening also in the Singapore port waters. So it's important to get many of the stakeholders together. I think that's the theme for today in terms of collaboration. We don't have all the answers, but we need to work together with the industry partners, research institutions, even the fuel suppliers to work on all these various aspects. These are some of the consortium that have actually come forward to work with MPA and the industry here to look at some of the ammonia aspects of the trial. During the Singapore Maritime, I think we also have many experts to come to share the various aspects of their ammonia study, and I think that's provide valuable inputs to the industry as well. Now, to look at this, developing a hydrogen-based ecosystem, it must be, we heard from the previous panel, it must be commercially feasible. Right? So if it to be, whether it is the market pricing, whether it is the standards, whether it must be cost effective, these are various aspects that we have to look at. So many of these is to make sure that this use of this future fuel are for multiple purposes, whether it is for power generation, for port operation, or for other applications on board the ships. So this is the future fuel pathway. I think DNV has done a great job in many of these forecasts. Locally, we are also building that capabilities in conjunction. This is a report by NTU researcher to look at some of this pathway for methanol, for biofuel, and in the context of Singapore and Asia, in our climate, the humidity is high, how it affects the biofuel, and how is it going to affect the engine of the boats and the ships that is using them. Those are studies that actually we will then pour in the investment dollar to get this report out so that we can then share it with the industry as well. I have 1 minute and 47 seconds, so let me just go on. These aspects of talent development is also important. So I think that's also one area in which we'll continue to work on. In fact, together with Singapore Maritime Foundation, we have set up a committee to look at the various new skills that our seafarers and our onshore colleagues that needs to be trained in, especially for the new fuel that is coming. So this is a group of many researchers and experts that we rely on, knowing that in this new fuel, besides the Class Society, which we are very happy that we are able to get the Class Society to work with MPA, we also want to build the capabilities in the research institution across Singapore to make sure that they look at the various aspects of fuel, the seafarers training, cybersecurity, digitalization, optimization. We talk about many of these AI programs that we actually have set up with the Research Institute. And beyond Singapore, I think the international partnerships are also important to enable this scaling of digitalization and decarbonization. So I think that's an important part is we also mentioned and heard is on the green corridor. And digital corridor, because we think that both green, which is decarbonizing, and the digital part is equally important. Putting these two elements together will gain the efficiency that we can see it immediately, as well as a longer term part of the future fuel. So I think many aspects, putting this together, catalyzing all these Maritime Singapore, I think that's the point that I'm going to make here. And there's just one short video on Tuas. Since I cannot bring you to Tuas Port, I thought maybe we bring the Tuas Port to you. So if I can ask colleagues to play it for you.
Wow. I mean, shipping and the maritime industry never looked so hip and future forward. That was a really cool video. Thank you very much, Kenneth, for that comprehensive overview on what Singapore is doing to decarbonize our maritime and shipping sector. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move now to our final panel discussion for today, Maritime Decarbonization, the Decade of Action. And we know that the maritime industry is at a pivotal crossroads right now. There's much to do, but as Knut Orbeck-Nielsen had just mentioned earlier, a maritime renaissance is upon us. So please join me in welcoming my panelists on stage. I'd like to welcome back on stage Kenneth Lim, the Assistant CE at MPA. And joining him, we have Mr. Paulo Tonon, the Technical Director at Berge Bulk, Mr. Andrew Hoare, the Global Head of Shipping at Fortescue Energy, Ms. Cristina Sayans de Santa Maria, the Regional Manager for Southeast Asia, Pacific and India at DNV Maritime, and Dr. Sanjay Kutan, the Chief Technology Officer at the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization. Welcome up to Christina and Dr. Sanjay, and thank you very much for joining me on stage, gentlemen. All right, so we know that the pressure for this industry to decarbonize is heating up. What would you guys say is the silver bullet to decarbonizing this industry? What would be the most important solution? Let's start with you then, Kenneth.
Well, I think we heard from the previous panel as well, there's no silver bullet. So I think it's all about working together, trying out, making sure that what is most cost effective, what is most feasible at this time, and then work towards end goal of the net zero in 2050 with intermediate steps of 2030, 40. I think if that's the plan that we have set out, and together with the various ecosystem players, I think we can take steps towards it.
All right, so intermediate timelines, 2030 to 2050. So we're not going to go to 2060, yeah, for this panel. Paolo, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I should have probably come here with my bowler suit today to just emphasize it's time for action. It's time for action. We need to test technologies. We need to try different type of fuels. And we need definitively to collaborate. Singing the same song of all the colleagues in the previous panel and what we are hearing, the collaboration is just paving the road, is minimizing risks for the one that are investing in novel technologies and new business models. Without that, it's very difficult to move on. But action now, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, so many are singing the same song, like they said. So Andrew, do you want to add on to the bridge of the song, maybe?
I think to add to that, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to recognize that industrial groups such as ourselves, a big mining group, actually is responsible for this climate catastrophe that we face today. So by deferring it to later, we are not doing our duty to the citizens of this planet. So we have to act now. As Paulo says, spending a lot of time in his boiler suit, me too recently, doing something quite interesting down the road, which I'll probably talk about later. But I think acting now is absolutely critical. But I think the silver bullet is also the fact that there are fuels there today which can be used, a little bit more effort, but again, acting now can make sure that those can become commercialized as quickly as possible to stop the catastrophe.
Nice, thank you, Andrew. Christina.
Yeah, we are very much aligned, I think, all of us. So it's about acting now, but it's also about taking into account the solutions that we have today, like, for example, energy efficiency, right? And now we have, Paolo and Bergeval doing great things. I'm sure he will talk about it later. But there are things that you can do today, actually. So that's extremely important, I think, building your strategy for your whole fleet and also building flexibility. That would help us for the future.
Flexibility. Thank you, Christina. Dr. Sanjay.
For me, I think it's a paradigm shift in our mindsets in three areas. One thing is we need to change our mindsets around return on investment as the sole driver for change. We need to start thinking about return on the environment as well. The second mindset change is the virtue of being a realist is limited. It should not make us feel that, because it's so hard, we should take our time. Time is not on our side. If you believe the IPCC report, tipping point will happen in the early 2030s, which means we need to move fast. I think Antonio Guterres, in his speech at the IPCC report on climate change 2023, said we have to move at warp speed. And to move at warp speed, we need to rethink the way we've adopted technology in the past. This old S-curve and things like that, all that has to change, right? And hopefully that necessity becomes the mother of invention. And the third mindset change must be that Mother Nature has to win in this whole journey. Not any individual stock market company, but Mother Nature has to win because if we truly believe it's an existential threat. So the silver bullet is really about mindset change.
On the ROI, the Mother Nature and time, moving at warp speed. Thanks, Dr. Sanjay. Now, so a recurring theme that also come up besides collaboration is acting now. And I want to come to Paolo and then Andrew for this question. Just give us an elaboration on what you guys are doing at Berge Bulk, and Fortescue Energy in terms of utilizing existing systems and fleets, or we're doing what kind of conversions that have really reaped benefits and results.
I think in Berge Bulk, we have designed our decarbonization journey and divided in 4 pillars. The number one is really a relentless focus on improving efficiency. We have been baseline 2008, and it's certified, reducing our carbon intensity 46%, which, you know, obviously we welcome very much what IMO has decided in the last MEPC meeting. But I think, you know, we need to do more and we need to do it faster. So, you know, new paints, Mewis duct, propeller boss cap fins, everything that, you know, are technologies that are really, really well known, use it and use it now. We are also testing new technologies. We are pretty much into wind propulsion. We have one vessel that is right now in the shipyard assembling 4 rigid wings, 37 meters long, 20 meters of cord, that by the end of the month, hopefully, we will all see sailing here in Singapore. And I think these are new technologies like flattened rotors. We are testing kites, air lubrications on our hull. We are hybridizing our fleet and being the first one in the industry, retrofitting 1.2 megawatt shaft generator, which is not a small piece of steel that you need to put and squeeze in the most difficult place on a vessel where the propeller shaft is. So all of this needs to be done, and we would have not been able to do it on our own without the support of class societies, and DNV has been a great support for Berge Bulk. Flag state authorities, our charterers to start with. We need to convince that their cargo is in safe and reliable hands when sailing with our vessel. So our charterers are definitely into the equation with us. So all of these things are extremely important. Our ambition is an ambition which is very, very strong. By 2025, we need to be carbon neutral. And we are also working very much on new fuels. We are working on biofuels, tested different types of them. We have been working on, and we're working on methanol. It's here, it's there. We have just heard it from Kenneth before. You know, the processes, the technologies exist. Of course, we need to solve the equation, fuel availability, fuel prices. I think we need to make sure that the chicken and the egg will become twins and not one and the others before. And in this respect, we will move on there. And we will also move on with ammonia in the future. And carbon capturing, essential. By 2050, there will still be an important part of of fossil fuels. So what do we do with them? And I think we are both in capturing carbon on board of the vessel and in capturing carbon ashore. So in that respect also, we are really committed to carbon capture ashore. By 2026, Berge Bulk will plant 25 million trees. By end of last year, we were planting 9.6 million of mangrovia trees to capture carbons around the globe. And we do it in all those areas where our customers are present and where our seafarers are present.
So very busy, definitely not resting on your laurels there, Berge Bulk. Thank you, Paulo. Andrew, your strategies.
Great to hear that work from a leading shipper. And I think for ourselves, the number one thing that we've done is we've committed to the elimination of fossil fuels from our business by 2030 for our Scope 1 footprint on the planet. I think that's very important because that's triggered now how we behave. I think we heard Knut in the introductory speech was talking about many new buildings today have the renewable option. Without being too contentious for once, I'm very concerned about that because I think it's very easy for engine manufacturers to say this is a dual fuel engine, but it's methanol, when we know that there isn't enough methanol on the planet to supply those ships. So it's concerned us a lot. So we've been pushing very hard on the ammonia side of things. We believe that that is the truly green fuel, carbon-free fuel that we can produce. So I think in February this year, we became the world first to test ammonia in a marine engine in Perth. It's still being tested now. So we're learning about the emissions. Stage 2, later this year, we will conclude the first fuel transfers on a ship that we're converting here in Singapore to show that ammonia can also be used in a marine capacity as well on board a ship. Now, these elements are very, very important. We're not trying to be an engine manufacturer. We're trying to say it is possible to do these things now, because if we don't do this, if we can't call out the engine manufacturers and say, look, it is possible, and we're supported very well by class, you need to act now. What's going to happen is they're just going to sell engines which are going to burn methanol and fuel oil, and they will only burn fuel oil. So the solution is not by seeing new buildings today with the dual fuel option. That is not a solution. That is kicking something down the line. I think we all know now that it cannot be kicked down the line. But elsewhere in the group, what we're doing, we're today testing ammonia in our locomotives in the Salomon mines in Australia, and we're still pursuing our endeavours to seek to convert our very large ore carrier fleet later on this decade at the right time. So we're doing an awful lot. What we want to do is we want to persuade the likes of Bergie Bulk to manage our Scope 3 emissions by getting them to be ready with their own technologies. We hope ammonia to join that journey with us so we can all reduce our not only Scope 1, but Scope 3 emissions as well.
So we know that by leveraging on some of the existing fleets and systems that we already have, we could achieve about 30 to 35% CO2 reduction by fully reaping the energy benefits and potential of what we already have in combination with some operational improvements. And I'm wondering from the likes of Dr. Sanjay or Kenneth, from your observation of the industry and you at the GCMD, what are the quick wins can industry players here capitalize on in the meantime? Dr. Sanjay, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think in the power sector, and we were going through the energy transition, energy efficiency was and still considered a renewable source of energy. Being energy efficient is just not about decarbonizing. It is actually good business sense because it reduces your OPEX, right? And I think that's important. I think it applies to shipping as well. And as we allow energy efficiency technology to seep in, and again, I go back to this whole ROI thing. People say, oh, I can't adopt it because it's too expensive. What is expensive? Expensive and from which perspective? From Mother Nature's perspective, she thinks it's cheap, right? So I think we need to think through. I think, and in that sense, I think energy efficiency is a very important lever. The other one that's in the near term is the biofuel area, because today's infrastructure can deploy biofuels, right? And it's a good way to start that whole process of weaning off fossil fuels as we wait for the green fuels to hit scale and available. So I think these two levers need to be played around very well. And if you slap on carbon capture on it, you can actually get down quite a bit in terms of your carbon emission. It's a combination of all these three moving parts.
So the focus, shifting the focus to energy efficiency and then biofuels. So I'll come back to you on biofuels there. Kenneth, your thoughts?
Yeah. So I agree with Sanjay. Since in the past, Sanjay and I, we were pushing very hard on the electrification for hovercraft when he was executive director of SMI. Efficiency is definitely an area that we want to do more. In terms of route planning, if you have optimized use of your assets, I think that's also a good use. And from where MPA comes, we are also advocating just in time. So what we have done is to get the various timing from everybody, from the port, from the harbor, pilotage, tugboat, from the bunker, everyone. If a ship calls on Singapore and can orchestrate the time, so 72 hours before you arrive, you actually estimate all the various time, and we make sure that all the activities are orchestrated. Then actually by the time the vessel comes, very little wastage, minimize the wastage, and then you get on with all your cargo operation, plus your bunkering, plus your ship supply, for your crew change. Then after that, you leave the port in the most efficient way. I think efficiency in terms of digitalization will be another quick win for everyone.
So efficiency in terms of...
Can I add something? Just to also add the fact that by adopting operational efficiencies, it will help alleviate the pressure on demand of carbon neutral fuels and also the price pressure, which will be, really key in the next years.
So it's a resounding energy efficiency, focus on energy efficiency there. Thank you, Christina and Kenneth and Sanjay. Alternative fuels, that's a big topic, right, in this maritime decarbonization. And according to the DNV's maritime forecast to 2050, shipping will require about 17 million tons of new fuels by 2030. And that accounts for about 30 to 40% of the global production volume by that time. So how is shipping going to secure this supply, given that we will have to compete with other transportation sectors, which will then also lead to uncertainty in supply and price fluctuations? So this is a time where I come to Kenneth, because you're from the government regulatory body. How should Singapore secure the supply of future fuels that we'll need?
I think
should it be regulated? Sorry, should supply be regulated also? That's another question.
Yeah, no, I think, when we talk about supply and demand, I think we have to act on both sides. So on the demand side, I think that is where, together with EMA, we started to call for this proposal for ammonia to be used for energy as well as bunkering. Because Singapore needs to start triggering and initiate this demand, right? And of course, with FFI and many of you will start to trigger that we need that fuel. Once that fuel is done, and then we can demonstrate that we can do it very safely and efficiently in Singapore, that builds up the confidence. And the supplier is also the supply side is also an area in which we are working with in terms of looking out where are the potential supply side and get them to come to Singapore, because Singapore is a major trading hub. So there's also this energy supplier can start with a trading desk and then come with shipping desk. And then if they start to do all this, then of course the fuel can come. So this is what, as a government, we could do both from the supply and the demand at the domestic level and at the IMO level to look at the various emission measures, controls, all the discussion about your bunker levy or whether it's a tax and all this. At the IMO level, how we could governize the various member countries to also come to a consensus on certain mechanism. So I think on both fronts, these are the areas that we are doing.
Paolo, how does that sound to you? Good?
Yeah, I think it's...
As someone who's a player in the industry.
This is the challenge we are having in front of us. It's not only a question of when the fuel will be available and at which price, but it's also the other very important challenge that we need to tackle immediately, and we are tackling it now, is competencies for new fuels. I mean, if we think that in merchant marine, the vast majority of the vessels are dry bulk carriers and then container vessels, those vessels historically have been low-handling technologies. So, and when I compare seafarer of those vessels versus seafarer or LNG, LPG carrier, the amount of knowledge and competencies is immense what we need to get. And without those competencies, it doesn't really matter that the fuel is available because we will not be capable to handle on board the vessel. So safety and knowledge are of paramount importance, and it needs to proceed in parallel with understanding where those fuel will be available, how are we going to bunker them, what's the well-to-wake equation for carbon intensity of those fuels, because most likely they will be produced far away from Singapore. And they need, if there is a physical bunkering, that's what we are going to expect, they need to be transported here. How are we going to transport those fuels here? So all of that is where a ship owner, very traditional as Berge Bulk, is right now, in discussing with different players and potential future partners on how to get that equation solved and move on and make the right bets for the future and minimize the risk for those bets.
Dr. Sanjay, can you weigh in then on what do you think are the two most economically viable future fuels that the stakeholders in shipping and maritime should be looking at first?
The challenge is you've got to kind of multiply it by the volumetric energy density factor. So it's just not the dollar per ton, but how much work can that ton of fuel do for you? So if you look at it, the closest thing is biofuels, which only have a 90%, it's 95% in terms of energy, right? But once you get into methanol, you need like 2.6 times the volume to get the same distance. You go to ammonia, you need 2.8 times. You go to hydrogen, you need 4.5 times, right? So it's changed, the equation changes, and it is just not about economic value. This is what I'm saying. We have to start thinking of, if it's just cost, and we're trying to make money and save money, then don't worry about decarbonization. Stick to fossil fuel. But if we're trying to decarbonize to save the world, then we need to have a different way we look at why are we burning this fuel, and what is that value. And I think the other thing, and the demand signals for the green supply chain has not been strong enough. Consumers must also demand for a green supply chain and are willing to share that cost of making that supply chain green. And I think that's where we all start working together. Collaboration is just not about the industry collaboration, but it's the entire human race collaboration to address this existential threat, right? And I think that's when you talk about price, because otherwise you'll just go around in circles. It'll never be the right IRR, not the right ROI, and
Yeah, and it comes back to your first point about that mindset shift that needs to happen, right? And Christina and Andrew, then, what necessary infrastructure has to be in place, to ensure that this, even if we had all these alternative fuels, it will actually contribute to the feasibility of maritime decarbonization. And I think we're also looking at refueling stations.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, infrastructure is one piece of the puzzle, right, of the whole fuel, because if you tackle the safety, but you are not able to reach to that, fuel, then it's, it's nonsense, right? So, but there's already some infrastructure in place, right? And some of these electrofuels and biofuels, for example, can use the EMGO, bio-MGO, can use the existing fuel oil infrastructure. Some of the carbon neutral liquid methane, like bio-LNG or e-LNG, could use the existing LNG infrastructure, right? We have several ammonia carriers, ammonia terminals, and methanol terminals, right? So there's something in place, but obviously it needs to be scaled up and be in the correct places. And then,
Thanks, Christina. Andrew?
Yeah, I think to add to that, obviously, for ammonia, which may be the ammonia carriers, may be one of the first hydrogen carriers to move molecules for the power sector. Of course, that doesn't need the bunkering infrastructure, so it's not facing that constraint. I think clearly ports like Singapore have a level of existing infrastructure to handle these multiple fuels, including potentially ammonia. I think what's going to change the industry significantly is the location of the production of the renewable fuels. Dr. Sanjay mentioned the volumeric challenges, and so it's more likely that many centers of these renewable fuels, ammonia, methanol, will set up in places of production. So I'm thinking of places like the Red Sea, Mediterranean, and so forth, which are on some of these green corridor routes. And I think these will develop as new bunkering hubs going forward, such that the product doesn't have to move to a bunkering hub. Singapore's quite close to Australia, so Australia not currently producing significant fuels. They will come to Singapore. So I think there'll be also a shift. I think the big question is going to be how governments accept floating storage as an accelerant or as an interim stopgap towards long-term, so land-based storage. Most countries are constrained in some way by land, and floating storage provides that option. I think the key to the adoption of the fuels is how quickly governments can accept the floating storage solution as a viable and safe solution for these new fuels.
Okay, so location, location, location. And if you're stationed here in Singapore, you know that we are obsessed about location. So it applies to the maritime sector too. We have a question from the audience that's related to this theme that we're discussing right now. So let's pull it up on the screen, please, for everyone to see. Will Singapore develop green ammonia and green hydrogen production facilities in here? Yeah, right here in Singapore. Kenneth?
I'll give you a try. And I think to produce this green ammonia and hydrogen, I think we have to look at what are the ingredients that you need to make this dish, right? And you need a lot of renewables. So when you talk about renewables, then the question is, does Singapore have enough renewables? Well, we have half, which is solar. But I always say, if anyone can come up with a technology to capture lightning, we will be good to produce. Because Singapore has, we are a lightning rod, right? We attract a lot of lightning. But otherwise, if we don't have this lightning energy, or maybe yet to come, then producing green hydrogen and green ammonia will be something of a challenge. And I think that is where we now then therefore have to look at elsewhere for carriers to bring such a fuel to Singapore. But we are not resting on our laurel. We continue to see what are the various renewable that we will have. Never say never. So one day, maybe the technology will mature.
Very optimistic. Yes, Dr. Sanjay.
Yeah, I think the Kenneth is right? So then the question for us in Singapore is, do we see nuclear as a green fuel? Because if nuclear is a green fuel, then we can have floating nuclear, small molten salt reactors or whatever it is to produce the green electrons, then you can get into the green production. But then, you need a mindset change to accept that nuclear is a green fuel, right? So there are opportunities, but at scale, I agree with Ken that there's no way. We are already a renewable shortage, right? For the building sector, the car sector, everyone wants green electrons. Yeah. Maritime is going to be further down the pecking order.
So speaking of nuclear, this is a really nice segue to our poll question to the audience. So we know that we need the right decarbonization technology to alleviate the need for new carbon fuel, low carbon fuels. So we would like you to key in your response to this question, please. Which decarbonization technology do you see as the most promising? I mean, there's nuclear propulsion there, but we also want to discuss with you guys here on the panel is that how is nuclear widely accepted by the public? Is that likely to change? And then we also want to talk about pink hydrogen. So let's have you just key in your responses. We have 5. This time around, there's multiple choice for you, so you don't have to key in 1, 2, or 3-word answers, but we have solid oxide fuel cells. Air lubrication systems doesn't seem to be as popular, okay. And then onboard CCS, nuclear propulsion. Okay, let's have more of you scan the QR code and input your answers. And then I want to get my panelists to chime in on the answers. It seems that onboard CCS is the most popular for now. Your thoughts? Anyone would like to chime in on the results that you're seeing right now? Is it within expectations, or any surprises there on the charts of how it's moving? Anyone? Paolo.
I might start here. I think it's well aligned with some of the thoughts we have in our company. And again, fossil fuels will be really still relevant by 2050. So we need to do something with fossil fuel. That's why carbon capturing is very important. And carbon capturing, as we have seen for a lot of other technology, has started already in land-based application, and they will be, once the technology matures, become smaller and more reliable and less bulky to be adopted easier on a vessel. So definitively supporting what the audience is telling us. Nuclear, as Berger Bulk, we have invested in companies developing thorium molten salt reactors. We might not really see a nuclear merchant vessel. I think the legislations and the rules and regulation will be extremely complex, but probably there will be a point to see what we call today the pink fuel becoming fully in the category of green fuels of the future.
Thank you, Paolo. Andrew, your thoughts on pink fuel?
I think putting pink fuel as a supplier to renewable energy, as Dr. Sanjay was mentioning, I think it's, I've always been a proponent on a personal basis for the use of nuclear. I think it's probably cut CO2 emissions by something like 30% than otherwise would have been for the last sort of 50 years. I think the challenge with nuclear is, number one, existing nuclear infrastructure is very, very old and decrepit. So anything new that comes in has to replace that. We know for the more traditional plants, there's a long approval process, a long design process, and it requires government subsidies. So what I see is that nuclear, pink nuclear, will compete directly with renewable energy. Renewable energy has overtaken in terms of growth compared to nuclear, which I think peaked in 2006. So what it stands to risk doing is to pulling resource away from renewable energy towards nuclear for a problem that may not be resolved until, say, 10, 15 years hence. And I think that's quite dangerous. I think there is also a little bit of a link between the nuclear lobby and the climate deniers, which I'm not going to talk about today. So generally, I think, yes, sure, develop your small-scale nuclear plans. I think ship nuclearization is very interesting, but some way off. But I would not want to see the pink debate eclipsing what we're trying to do on the renewable side, because I think it could be very dangerous. It will stop us acting today. We'll be under the false pretension that something is possible in the future. One thing is clear, that the fuels are available today. They can be manufactured today, whereas nuclear, it is still untested for these small-scale plans. So I think be very, very careful. I think it's misleading.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you still stand resolute for the focus to stay with renewable energy side. And Dr. Sanjay, perhaps you could give us an update on some of the onboard CCS projects that's happening on the GCMD now, given that we had 55 logins for onboard CCS.
Yeah, no, happy to. I mean, we started this journey almost within months of when we first got established in August 2021. We started talking to the industry about onboard carbon capture. We spent about 6 months evaluating whether GCMD would get involved, and in 2022, we made a conscious effort to start really deep diving and learning, all the intricacies of doing that. And we launched Project Remarkable, which is the one you're referring to, on phase 1. And phase 1, when we did it about 15 months ago, when we started off, we really didn't know very much. And I must say, and we've been doing a tech scan recently, in fact, we just finished a white paper on this for the board, that so much has changed. In the last 12 months, the amount of technology solutions that emerged from nowhere that is making onboard carbon capture more of a reality today than it was 15 months ago when we started this journey. Thank God we had this gate process of doing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So we're now, end of phase 1, we're thinking through what is the next step, because now that we have this new tech around, they're still early days, but they're very promising. So we're re-looking at the strategy. But you remember, our project on Remarkable was not just about onboard carbon capture. It was an end-to-end, right? Which means we need to close the loop. So you just don't capture it. We got to offload it, and then we got to sequester it or utilize it or close the loop on the CO2. So you literally fix the CO2 and you pull it out of the environment. And that's our entire project, just not on the onboard carbon capture. So it's looking good. We've learned a lot, and we hope to share all those learnings with the industry when we finish the report. But now the next stage, we're thinking of how we piece the whole ecosystem together to close the entire loop on carbon capture, because it is just not about onboard carbon capture. It is about offloading, it's about utilization and fixing or sequestration. We have to complete the chain to make sure that we decarbonize.
That's really promising. Promising to see that there have been like exponential improvements and findings just within 15 months. So we have much to look forward to. Thank you, Sanjay. And Christina, given your remit, looking after Southeast Asia, Pacific, and India, how should ship owners or charterers place their bets in such a complex environment with choices?
Yeah, no, I think they, as I said, I think they need to make a strategy for their fleet, because they will not be able to have every vessel green one, right? But make a good and effective strategy. Do what you can do today. There are short-term actions like route optimization, vessel reduction, hull and propeller cleaning, right? And then look at your medium term and long term, like which onboard CCS could play a role in, even nuclear, right? And I'm surprised about the low score on their lubrication system, which, by the way, is already installing around 250 vessels, and it has quite a lot of potential. But I think it's also extremely important that we have is a measurement of real performance, because we have estimates, but as we need to keep working on how to get the real performance of the vessels.
Fair point. Thank you, Christina. Gentlemen, just very quickly, when Christina looked at the poor results on air lubrication systems, I saw you guys like wink at each other. I mean, what was that about?
I was not able to see it from the table. I would have commented before. I'm surprised because air lubrication, to be honest, is the only technology which is not route dependent. You can use it on routes where there is lack of wind. You can still use it on routes where there is more wind. So, it's a very versatile technology. I have to say, there is still a lot to be done, and we have air lubrication in some of our vessels, and we are definitively developing the way of operating that technology. But it's a versatile technology, much more than wind, where...
So let's not poo-poo air lubrication systems just yet, guys.
Not yet.
And Kenneth, I just want to quickly get your thoughts before we wrap this question to go to the final one about nuclear possibility in Singapore. Your thoughts?
Yeah, for Singapore, actually, naval and submarines actually have been calling on Singapore too, which are nuclear powered. So I think we have developed some capability to handle such crafts and such ships. So I think, but it's always an ongoing learning process. But having a nuclear, say, reactor in Singapore, now that's another question. Yeah. It's like, should I put it in Ang Mo Kio or should I put in East Coast?
Floating.
Floating. Right? Even if it's floating, should I put in the East Coast part, near to the East Coast, or near to the West Coast part?
It's all about location.
Yeah, about location again, and I think there's also that social aspects that we have to be mindful, and we want to make that decision. Yeah. But I think what Singapore is doing is to build up that capability. So in the National Research Foundation, they actually build up centers to look at nuclear safety, because regardless of when it's going to happen, right? It's when, right? It's not whether it happened, it's when it's going to happen. Then we must build up that capability to handle it safely. whether it is offshore, nearshore, or even onshore. I think that's important. For carbon capture, we always are watching it very carefully to see how, as Sanjay said, end-to-end, because we always understand the tank of fuel, one part, then you generate 3 parts of CO2. You can capture 1 part, but if you put the 3 parts onto your board, that means you have to sacrifice your space. So I think there's many of these aspects that I think technology, as they mature, we will have to watch on carefully. But otherwise, I think, yeah, air lubrication, those existing technology, please use them because this is not route dependent and digitalization, and we will try to advocate that during at the green and digital corridor, so that different between port to port, if we could really harness this, calculate the emission reduction, and I think we can then show proof to the industry how this technology has helped the shipping lines.
Very well explained. Thank you, Kenneth. So I'm mindful of the time. We're going to close this panel now with one final question to each of you. We've discussed so much today. No more silver bullets. What's the one thing you think needs to happen to ensure that everything that was said actually comes to fruition in the next decade, right? This is called the Decade of Action for Maritime Decarbonization. Dr. Sanjay, let's start with you.
Paradigm shift, mindset change.
Paradigm shift, mindset change. Wow, thanks. I like that. Christina?
Yes, that everyone has a strategy and installs some energy efficiency devices in their vessels.
Okay, so pick out your strategy, focus on energy efficiency. Andrew?
Like no more see now, more about can now, and the power of now.
Oh, don't see now. Okay, so see how.
See
can,
how.
Yeah,
No,
don't
no
see,
more, no
how.
more see how.
Can now.
Can
okay.
now.
Okay, I like
Power
that.
now.
Yes, I'll remember that. Paolo?
Be open-minded, keep on working with the new players that are really coming in our industry that were not there a few years back, and you know, diversify the way we think for making a change.
Be open-minded and diversify. Thank you, Paolo. Kenneth?
Yeah, I think taking action, I think it's the team and the collaboration. I think that's important. Shipping is both small emitter plus also an enabler for new fuel. So I think Maritime stands a good opportunity to collaborate.
So the maritime renaissance will be upon us sooner than we think if we act now. Ladies and gentlemen, shall we give this wonderful panel a big round of applause? Thank you very much for these wonderful takeaways today. Thank you. Thank you to each of you. Okay, we're coming to the end of the conference. I want to thank my speakers again. And before we go, I'd like to invite Mr. Brice Legallo to come up and say a few words, please. We want to take one photo together, too. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and Christina. Thank you.
Dear everyone, so a few words from my side to close the event. First of all, a big thank you for joining us today. I really hope that you enjoyed it. We were around 300 people in the room today, and around 2,000 people joining us remotely. So I really hope that you enjoyed the day. Number two, big thank you to all our speakers, all our partners, and the organizers. I really think that it was, you all did a great job, so big thank you for this. As we said, I mean, this is the decade where either we make it or we break it. The window is getting very, very slim, but there's still some hope. And the reason why we organize these kind of events here at DNV is, I think, it's twofold. The first thing is that the topic at hand is extremely complex. It's extremely diverse, and therefore we're running these kind of events to be able to bring thought leaders together, to be able to explain some of those complexities, to be able to share their thoughts on where the challenges are, where the opportunities are, and how we can bring solutions to solve this problem. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing these kind of events. And then the second thing is we also hope that by creating those events, we also create new connections, new opportunities for you in the room and online to kind of think about new solutions, create new partnerships. And I think that's also one way to make some progress. So again, big thank you for joining us. We will be publishing our new Maritime forecast very soon. We'll also be publishing our new Energy Transition Outlook 2023 in a few weeks' time, as well as how we think the various countries in ASEAN could work more closely together when it comes to having a more interconnected part of the world. So big thank you again. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Brice. Really like that succinct closing there. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you for being a wonderful audience and staying with us throughout the entire afternoon of the DNV SETC. We want to once again take this opportunity to thank our supporting partners, the Norwegian Energy Partners, the Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore, and Sue for their contributions. And again, a recording of today's conference will be made available on demand in the next few days. And for the unanswered questions, thank you so much for submitting them, by the way. The DNV team will do their best to send their responses to you in the next few days. So we hope you've had a really fruitful day with us. So we really appreciate your participation. And of course, we hope you leave with a deeper understanding of the urgency of the energy transition. My name is Yvonne Chan. It's been a pleasure to be a part of your program, and we look forward to connecting with you outside during the networking reception. Thank you very much and have a great evening ahead. Thank you.